Okay, we'll get started. First off, I want to introduce Tom Cannon, who's gracious enough to be here yet again this year. We gave him last year off, so I'm glad he's here. Tom farms down at Blackwell, Oklahoma, all no-till for 20 years now. Some irrigated, a lot of dry land. He's got cattle as well. Probably that's an even bigger thing to him than the farming. But the thing about Tom is that he really pushes the envelope on everything he does. That's just his personality. And I don't know of anybody who's more meticulous about seed placement than Tom is. He's more meticulous than I am, which is quite a stretch, but he is. And the results show up. I mean, he has beautiful stands, and he has some of the top yields in the area every year. So it's worth that attention to detail. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt Hagney. I grew up on a grain and cattle farm in South Dakota. Came down here and started working in '94, working exclusively on no-till. And I did custom seeding for a lot of years there in the 90s because nobody wanted to go buy a no-till drill to try no-till. So I offered that service so that people could try it on a small scale. So I've got a lot of experience both in South Dakota and down here with running drills and planters, and I've just done a lot of work over the years trying to make this stuff work better, because most of it's still designed for tilled seed beds. You might think that this over here is a no-till drill, but it was sort of a compromise, and it's a struggle to get the engineers to truly understand what's going on. So, how many of you do not own a planter? Okay. You guys can take a nap for about an hour. We'll wake you up. Actually, a lot of the principles are the same on a planter versus a drill, but the equipment obviously is different. And who knows, maybe you'll want a planter someday, or you've got somebody custom planting for you and they're not getting the results. The first thing, all right, some of you guys have been here before. When we're adjusting a planter, what is the very first thing we must do? Level the hitch. And actually, we don't care about the hitch, we care about the row unit. I don't really even care to look at the frame and markers too much. Markers are nice. They give you a pretty good reference point. But if you've got some play in your linkages here, this can be perfectly level, and the row unit might not be. So if you don't have a row unit that has a nice straight edge that's supposed to be horizontal, I would suggest you install one so you can visually tell what you're doing. As you change tractors, change inflation pressure in the tires on the tractor, we need to make sure that this is level to nose up, preferably nose up by 2 or 3 degrees. It makes a huge difference in all the adjustments, from the row cleaner to the Keaton, to how the closing wheels behave, to how much down pressure you're achieving. As we rotate this into slightly nose up, we're getting more pressure out of springs. Doesn't matter on airbags, but it does with springs. As we rotate that a little bit nose up, what's happening to our seed tube? It's getting more vertical, and that's a good thing, because you're dropping farther forward in relation to the blades. So it's more controlled. You don't have as much sidewall caving in on you, dust and duff falling into the furrow. Because the trajectory, the planter's moving forward, so the trajectory of that seed is way back here to where the blades are coming out of the ground, is where the seed actually arrives at the bottom of the furrow. So if we don't control sidewall blowout adequately, we've got trouble with placement. And the difference between a few degrees nose down versus a few degrees nose up, it's all the difference in the world in seed placement. I can cure so many things by just getting that hitch a little bit higher.
There's really nothing that I've found that's more difficult to plant than trying to plant cotton this last year into moisture conditions where you have moisture about 3/4 of an inch to an inch deep, fairly loose on top, and my seed guys are telling me absolutely do not plant cotton over an inch deep, no matter what, which I should know better, really. I really should, because everybody always tells you to plant too shallow. Some of the stuff we went to 1.25 inches and did well with, but the stuff we were trying to keep right at 1 inch, there was a difference between incredible success and very, very marginal stand, and it all came down to the position of that row unit, that it was running nose up a little bit, because we were dropping the seed further forward in that trench. Whenever you have loose ground, loose soil, and we've been no-till 20 years, really mellow, you can get some crumbling, and if it gets dry on top, that crumbling can come down and then you have dry dirt. Even though you're down at a depth where you have moisture when you're checking, you've got dry dirt in and around your seed because you're throwing that seed too far back. It also has to do some with down pressure. You know, you got to keep your gauge wheels up against the disc, and they got to be there where they're holding that sidewall intact as long as possible. One thing that I do not understand, and I really don't, is why one of these planter manufacturers haven't came up with some kind of a micro switch or something that will control your 3-point and maintain your you know, your degree of angle, that 3 degrees up, 2 degrees up. Why can't they do that? It's so easy to do on other things. You know, you go over a terrace and what do you got? You got a great stand on one side, then your next pass you got a great stand on the other side, then the next pass a great stand on that side. But where you're going up over that terrace, there's times whenever you don't even have your closing wheels intact with the ground. You know, it's ridiculous. That would be so easy. Why haven't I designed that? Why haven't you designed that, man? Design something
I hadn't thought about it till now.
That can control either your 3-point on a 3-point mounted planter. On mine, it's a drawbar planter, but it's a 24 road that has a cylinder up there. And that cylinder controls the height of my drawbar, therefore it controls the level of my planter. It would be so simple for somebody to do that. I was cussing that all year. I was trying to plant cotton. Now, if I'm in the planter, myself, planting, and I go over a terrace, I go real slow because my cylinder on that drawbar is slow, and I try to manually run it as I go over it to maintain the right degree of, you know, that 2 degrees. I try to maintain that because it's super hard. You know, you're eyeballing it from the cab. Then you get on level and you go back to your preset position. Yeah, I just don't understand why that hasn't been done.
Well, one reason is because you're not always on level terrain.
Right.
So you've got to provide feedback as to how that's
right. And micro switch or some kind of height sensors front and back. I mean, I don't care, something. I know the technology's there. It should be done, but that's probably for another day.
Yeah.
I've worked with John Deere back in the 20 years ago with the 1850 and 1860 drill, and they didn't even understand their own software. I mean, they really didn't. And then if I try to reconfigure to plant on 15s instead of every 7.5 inches, trying to reconfigure their software at that time, I mean, I'm on the phone for hours with DTAC going, no, you know, just kind of arguing with them. So, you know, large companies, kind of like large government, it takes a while for things to take place. It really is.
Well, that's a big digression there, but
Sorry.
That's how, yeah, he's asking questions I haven't even thought of. Like, yeah, we could make that automated. We could at least make an idiot light in there. It's like, hey, your planter units are nose down. Do something.
Better run to the patent office real quick. And get better run to the patent office real quick.
Yeah,
and get something back.
I guess. You guys are all sworn to secrecy. So that levelness affects how your closing wheels work too, because they're tilted out from vertical on this bracket, and so if you're nose down, that bracket does this. And so now I got my angles wrong. If you're nose down, it kicks the back up, and so this becomes this. So now you've actually got toe in, and the closing wheels don't do anything at that point. They're like moving soil back out. Just by raising the hitch and getting those these row units a little bit nose up, we've now converted this to some of this. We've now created, some of that vertical tilt has become toe out. And so, as we all know, well, I hope to show to you today, if you're not already familiar with it, toe out on the closing wheels helps gather that soil back in. So we want a certain amount of toe out. So if you can't get the furrow closed, one thing to pop into your mind is, are the row units nose up? How many of you run row cleaners on your planters? Less than half. How many of you run coulters? I'm not talking fertilizer openers, just coulters. Okay. We've only got one person to convince that you don't need coulters. But coulters just, they mess up your seed bed. All those coulters used to be all the rage in the corn belt, and now most of them are laying in the back of the shed somewhere. There's nothing good that comes from running a coulter in front of the row unit.
Well, Dwayne Beck says that if you bought them and your wife knows you bought them, then you can't take them off. You just set them where they're about 2 inches above the ground and leave them on there.
That's another option.
Yeah.
Set them really shallow, like six inches above ground.
Yeah, really shallow.
Really shallow. For row cleaners, back in the early 90s, all the row cleaners were a design of a long straight finger like this. Then Yetter came out with the shark tooth, which is more of a triangular shape. In fact, there's a mimic of it over here on the drill. Everybody know what a shark tooth wheel looks like? Not enough. I should have brought a prop. The prop is over there. The trouble with the long, skinny row cleaners is that they would sometimes dig too much, and they would sometimes spear a corn stalk, things like that. The Yetter shark tooth doesn't have any problems like that, and it's less prone to wrapping because it's not that long spoke that things are wanting to wrap around onto. There's not much place for things to wrap. So if you're running row cleaners on planters, I would strongly suggest you move to a shark tooth or a mimic of that. The shark tooth works so well that all of a sudden everybody's copying it, which I assume is because the patent expired. So Martin's now got one that looks just like a shark tooth. I can't remember what it's called. And Dawn has one that looks vaguely similar, but it's different. The shark tooth and the Martin copy of it, it's a perfectly flat wheel. The Dawn ones are dished out a little bit in the direction of travel. What do you think happens when you do that?
Dirt.
It digs a furrow. So that's not a good design. And actually, Sunco Sabertooth also has that concave on the front edge, and they tend to slice and dig and carry on. They're not a good design. So use a shark tooth or the Martin mimic of it. And then there's various ways of holding that row cleaner onto the row unit. The old style was the pin adjust that mounted solid to the row unit. And these were great fun when you decided you wanted to adjust the row cleaner. You spent an hour underneath there moving these pins and getting scraped up and
Dropping
cursing.
on your knee.
Yeah, it was not a pretty scene. So Dawn had one called the screw adjust. They still have it, I believe. That it just had threads in there, and you'd go along there and you'd have the whole thing adjusted in about 2 minutes. Beautiful design. There's copies of that now too after the patent's expired. I think Yetter has one. Martin might too. Then we came with floating row cleaners were sort of always in the mix. Now there's two ways to make a floating row cleaner. You can push it like this, or you can trail it like this. What do you suppose happens when you push it like that?
Digs a furrow.
It wants to dig. It's like pushing the stick. It wants to dig. Trailing doesn't dig. It wants to ride out like a rake. So we prefer the trailing if you're going to have them truly floating. Don makes one. It goes by some acronym that I can't remember. GFX, I think, is what it's called. Which you can get hydraulic control on it or just let them free float. Ag Focus, that you probably haven't heard of. Ag Focus makes one that's trailing. And they've got a mimic of the shark tooth wheel also. They call theirs a Ninja. Those puppies are sharp, by the way. All of them are sharp, but those Ninjas are really, really sharp. So those are some options. If you're using one that's pushed like this, if you, either with the bolt or with your spring and air cylinder, if you prevent them from, set them so that they only go so far down, they work pretty good. So then they're just flexing up, like when you go over a terrace or something. So they're workable in that regard. But if you want the cat's meow, I would suggest a trailing link.
I have an opinion, like we all do, but as far as row cleaners are concerned, if your residue is spread evenly, and that's a big if, but if your residue is spread evenly, I have never seen a case where I needed a row cleaner. Ever. Well, one exception to that might be cow patties. If you've got a lot of cattle running and you need to move some of those. But my row cleaners are air cylinder, and they run 95 to 99% of the time up. I very, very rarely use them. But there are those times when you have residue that gets moved off-site due to rain or wind or something, and you'll have little areas where you see it coming, you lower them down, let them tickle, and move that stuff out of the way a little bit.
How much residue are you dealing with?
200 bushel corn, and we've dealt with that. We got irrigated stuff. 80 to 100 bushel wheat at times. We use a stripper on that though, so residue distribution is pretty easy.
How do you handle corn? Your head chops it up? Or?
Leave it standing as tall as possible. The least amount of disturbance to that corn stalk, the better. And I've used this example many times. If you have a short pencil, it's hard to break. If you got a long pencil, it's easy to snap. The longer your residue is, the easier it is to plant through, by far. It's easier to cut, it's easier to manage, and the more it's standing, the more standing residue you have, it's much, much easier down. You got to think about where you're planting. You're just planting down there in that, 2 inches deep, 1 to 3.5 inches deep. You're right down there in that small little microclimate, right where your disc is running. If you've got a lot of tall standing stuff, it's not laying over in the way of that. So I like all my residue as tall as I can possibly get it.
You don't worry about stalks getting in chains and wrapping and that sort of thing?
I don't use chains anymore, but at the time, yeah, that was occasionally a problem, but very rarely. And I've planted into 6-foot tall rye. I've planted into, 10-ton sedan grass cover crops. So it's not, the problem isn't what's from 1 inch up. That stuff's not a problem. It's really not. It's only that stuff that's right at the surface.
For the people that have chains or worried about hoses or wiring, you can put a knockdown pipe in front of your planter or drill, and it takes care of all that. So I am a firm believer in keeping those corn stalks as tall as possible. It just makes everything so much easier for the following crop. And it makes the residue last longer, which we need it to last longer in this part of the world. So Tom brings up a good point that I forgot to cover. Do you even need row cleaners? The farther south you go, the lower the residue will be, and the less likely you are to need row cleaners. My rule of thumb is somewhere around I-70, I-80 north, you probably need row cleaners. Farther south, it depends on what you're doing to manage your residue distribution. Like, are you using a shellborne head, or are you still using a sickle head? If you use a sickle head, you probably need row cleaners. Shellborns, it's like a dream. Plant right through it. So I have a lot of people that have row cleaners. I'm an agronomist, consulting agronomist, and I am asked to set up equipment for these guys when they trade planters, or I'm out there looking at it, and if I see something that could be made better, I write it on my report. I have a lot of guys that just don't run row cleaners, or they have them on the planter and they basically do nothing other than add weight to the row unit. And they might occasionally, like you say, you encounter a clump of straw that washed around or whatever, and you need to kick that out of the way. But what I see with the guys that really do have plentiful mulch, extremely heavy wheat, a lot of times, one of my favorites in this part of the world is to come in and plant pearl millet after wheat before we go to corn or milo the next year. And on a good year, that stuff will get, about this tall and head out and be so thick you can hardly walk through it. You need a machete. So that, in combination with 80 bushel wheat or better, that's a lot of material. And what I see is that I absolutely hate erosion. I hate weeds. So we've gotten to the point where we don't do anything with the row cleaners because I can't stand seeing bare soil. But it is hurting our stands a bit. And I think we're going to, where we really do have mega residue like that, we're going to do just a little more tickling. We never, ever, no matter how much you've got out there, don't move more than 50%. But we're probably going to start trying to move 20% in those extremely heavy conditions. Just too many missing plants. Now, if you're dropping the seed farther forward, it's less of an issue, because you get all these little pieces of straw in the furrow, and that causes allelopathy, disease, poor seed to soil contact, all that. So if you're using a brush belt tube, like Deere's Exapta Emerge, or you've got Precision Planting Speed Tube, those are dropping the seed so much farther forward in relation to the blade. The blade's coming here, and they're dropping right here, whereas your conventional seed tube and the arc of the seed coming back here, it's way back there. Those, I don't really care about the spacing. It really doesn't matter. Paul Gauss has adequately proven that spacing doesn't matter. In fact, a lot of times doubles help you. What really matters is all the plants have to come up at exactly the same time. Like if they're coming up this time of year in 3 days, they better all be up within a few hours of one another. If it's cooler in the spring and it takes 2 weeks for them to come up, they better all be up within 1 day. Those late ones are just weeds. So one thing I would like to do is to control that depth more precisely, is to drop the seed farther forward. And Deere has, how many of you have actually heard of the John Deere straight seed tube? Yeah, damn near nobody knows what the hell I'm talking about. Yeah, I'm not surprised. The straight seed tube, instead of having this curvature, it's just perfectly straight. It's got one little dog leg in it, but it's dropping the seed probably 2 to 3 inches farther forward in relation to the blade, much more controlled. Nobody knows about it. I've been talking about it for years, but nobody ever converts to it. And one of the problems now is, while we don't have any seed tube guards that work well with that, you have to run OEM, and we know those OEM guards last, a couple of days before they're worn out. So I think by next year we'll have some of our Valians that will work with a straight seed tube. So you might want to consider that.
That's good news. That's really good news.
For those of you who can't afford to upgrade to a speed tube or an Exapta merge, I think we can do a lot for your placement. And I don't know why I've had this in my mind for, well, over 15 years, and I guess I've never got it done because nobody knows about the straight seed tube, and so I got to educate them on what that is, and I figured there wouldn't be much demand, but maybe I just need to do the education in order to sell the product and fix the problem. Questions, comments on that, on what we've done so far?
I would say that, you know, we're going to talk a lot about attachments here today, and different add-ons and things that you can add value to your planter and certainly add value to your crops. And there are some things that are amazing, that really, really do help. But I think number one is adequate maintenance. I would rather have a stock planter just like this first one, and this might not agree with Matt, with sharp discs, good gauge wheels that's set right and level or slightly nose up, than I would every attachment you can buy for one. I think number one is your basic maintenance on your planter has to be right. You have to have good gauge wheels that fit snugly, and bushings that aren't wore out, and you know, all this. I think that's number one, and when you get that done, then there's real value you can add to your stand and to your vigor of your seedlings with other attachments. But before we get into a lot of attachments, I really wanted to stress that. New disc or like new discs that are super sharp, especially when we're in no-till. I just think it's critical.
The question was, would a straight coulter running very shallow with a depth band help you if you didn't have row cleaners, help you cut? You can't make it cut that shallow. It would have to be like this big in diameter to cut adequately for an inch deep, and then it's going to plug and slide all the time. So to make a coulter cut, you run it 2 or 3 inches deep. Well, that totally screws up your sidewall integrity and your seed placement and everything else. So
the reason Matt says that you would need a small disc is because the angle of the blade as it enters the ground. If you've got a blade that's this big and you're only trying to go an inch deep, the angle of the blade trying to cut that straw is going to hairpin more of it than it's going to cut. That's what he's getting at.
Thank you for explaining.
Yeah.
I might have got around to it at some point.
What about the seam needles? Do you have any comment on those?
He's talking about the ones that are like a sawtooth blade around the edge. I haven't actually dealt with them. In fact, I haven't taken them seriously enough to even worry about it. I can't imagine them working, but I might be wrong.
Realize that your disc is creating your V in the ground. And if your disc isn't a consistent size, then your seed at the bottom is not going to be at a consistent depth. Every one of those little cutouts, for lack of a better term, in that blade, if your seed lands on one of those, it's shallower. If it goes to where the deeper part is, then it's going to be deeper. And you're just building into an uneven V bottom with those. It's not going to be even.
Exactly. Acra plant had a long time ago, they had these scallop blades, and one was like 13 scallops and the other 15 or something, so that they never completely aligned. And so they cut straw better, undoubtedly, but the bottom of the furrow was all ragged and uneven, and they pulled more sidewall out. They were just a terrible effect in the real world. And I'm pretty sure that sawtooth blade's going to be more of the same. We really, in long-term no-till, where the soil's structured, your feet didn't sink in, if you have a long piece of straw there, it's not that hard to cut it with sharp opener blades.
And compared to the cost of seed, replacing opener blades it doesn't take that long, it's not that hard, and we do it 2 or 3 times a year, put new blades on. They're cheap compared to the cost of seed.
Question? Just a couple of comments. One, somebody was asking about throwing chains. Marker arms seem like, in corn stubble, seems like they're the worst thing in the world for throwing chains, because it leans all those stubble right into your planter. And then on the row cleaners, I've got row unit mounted cleaners, and it makes an incredible amount of difference as far as the amount of down pressure you need on those row units when you lift those openers up as compared to putting them down. So if you're running your row cleaners down or running your row cleaners up, and then you like your seed depth, but you put them down, you're taking a lot of weight off that row unit, and you may not have enough depth anymore.
Yep.
Tom, how many acres are you getting on your blades before you change?
That's a good question. Just when they're wore out, and it depends so much on moisture, upland, bottomland. I mean, it changes fast. Oh, if I've got an 1/8 of an inch off of them, the next time we get a rain, I'll probably be looking at changing. They just got to stay sharp. They got to stay sharp. That's all there is to it. And when they get dull, we're changing them.
If you keep them long enough, they'll get sharp again because they're rubbing against each other. But your diameter is down, and that creates other issues for where your seed tube guard is and things like that. But first they get dull, and that once you start losing part of that bevel, they're a lot duller than new.
It depends some on conditions too, you know. Planting through stripper straw, double crop beans, is really easy. And if the moisture's right and everything's right, then I might run them a little longer than I would other times a year. You know, planting that cotton, I was thankful I had new discs when I started, because everything just had to be perfect on that. Super expensive seed too.
How many people run sideband fertilizer openers on their planters? A few. I was indoctrinated by Dwayne Beck to think that we have to put all our fertilizer in the ground. We had to have these sideband openers. So when I started here in '94, we equipped all the planters with sideband openers. And gradually over the years, due to logistics and everything else, we kind of got away from doing that for a number of reasons. It's one more item that you have to have enough frame weight to hold in the ground. It's one more thing chopping up and burying residue. One more thing compacting the soil. And our soils are fragile enough here compared to the Dakotas that we really struggle with infiltration and compaction and things like that. So it just became a point of, hey, we can get rid of half the openers if we just ditch these sideband openers. And so we've moved in that direction. I'm very happy with that. I think, yeah, you can be 5 to 10% more efficient with your nitrogen, putting it all in the sideband location, but you figure your loss of residue, that alone negates that 5 to 10% savings in nitrogen. You figure planting some extra weed seeds, you figure the equipment, the loss of efficiency when you're trying to plant, you're money behind trying to put all that nitrogen in the ground. And if you want to just put some over there, if you truly have abundant residue, well, go ahead. But I wager that most of you do not really have excess residue or plentiful residue. We struggle so hard to keep enough. So I didn't shed a tear when those sideband openers went away. Now, if you are going to run sideband openers, we need them a fair distance away from where the seed opener is going to run, 5 inches. Because otherwise, they're disrupting the soil where that seed opener runs. And I have more seeds getting lodged under chunks of sidewall, more sidewall blowout. I'm not cutting as clean a furrow on that side because it's already been disturbed. The closing wheels, if you're running spoke closing wheels, they behave differently. on the side that's already has that slit in there. They may pull that whole chunk and roll it out. Bad things happen. So we move them 5 inches away. Now, how deep do they have to run? Can anybody explain to me what 2 by 2 means correctly? 2 inches over and 2 inches below the seed, which is 4 inches deep if you're planting corn 2 inches deep, which you should. It takes one hell of a lot of frame weight and down pressure to run 4 inches deep in these no-till conditions. It's just darn near impossible. Well, it's not impossible, but it's highly impractical. And if you did accomplish it, there's so much compaction on that side of the row, your roots aren't going to grow where the fertilizer is anyway. So that was left over. That was an idea from conventional till, where you dried it all out with tillage, and the crown roots on corn, halfway between where they sense light and the seed, they will set the crown roots, which go on to become the main root system of the plant, not the little ones that initially grow below the seed. Those wither away, usually die off by V5 or so. So your crown roots are up here. Because you've dried the surface with tillage, and it dries off quickly and gets too warm every time the sun comes out, the roots tend to want to grow down at about 45 degrees. So the idea was to put the fertilizer down here so that the roots would grow into it. It didn't have a lot of roots in the upper 2 inches. Now that we're no-till, we do a much better job of keeping moisture right at the soil surface. So instead of those crown roots going down, a lot of times they'll actually even arc up a little bit, especially if it's wet. They'll grow, you can scratch the surface mulch away and there'll be roots right there, because that's the perfect place. They have enough oxygen, they have moisture, and the best nutrients are right there at the surface where things are decomposing. That's where they want to grow. So we've got tremendous rooting in the upper 2 inches. We no longer need to place that fertilizer 4 inches deep. In fact, it doesn't even need to be as deep as the seed. Just, if you're going to run sideband openers, just run them an inch deep. Unless you're super dry, then maybe 2 inches. But if it's taken down pressure away from the row unit, shallow them up. The job one is this, staying at the proper depth. I could care less how deep the fertilizer is.
We have a 24-row planter with a hitch on the back of it like this. It's set up for my air cart. So my cart from my drill pulls along behind it. Used to. But it was so heavy, I just couldn't, and destroying extra residue, that I didn't even, and it was difficult to evenly distribute through the distribution centers that it had on my planter. Very difficult to distribute the fertilizer evenly. And so what I ended up doing, I don't even use that anymore. It's a hitch on the back. It's for extra weight, I guess. But I don't even need to pull that anymore. I thought, boy, I just had it figured out. You know, what was this, 5 years ago? Something like that, 6 years ago. I thought, man, I've got it figured out now. I'm going to pull this air cart. I only have to fill once a day with starter. It's going to be perfect. Well, when you put that much in there and you're only filling once a day, then you're carrying all that weight back and forth over your field. And I just did not see near enough benefit from it. It's a great idea in theory, but when you start putting it into practice, like a lot of things, it's not working as well. So I haven't used it now in 2 years. It stays hooked up to my air drill. And it actually didn't have any openers out on the front. We were just broadcasting it about 3 inches wide right behind the row on the surface. And I take that back. It's actually set, it goes through this hole, I remember. It goes through this hole, so it's broadcasting it over the V before the V is shut. And I was getting about 1/3 of that starter down in the row and then kind of worked in with my Thompsons. And I thought, boy, you know, that sounds like agronomically that would be about perfect. But I just can't handle dragging that weight all over the place all day. So I don't do it anymore. And I'm not a real big fan of phosphorus anymore anyway. You know, I'm trying to get that biologically. heavy emphasis on trying to get that biologically. The experts say that it works, and it works in the hoop houses where they do some of their research, but I'm not sure I'm getting it done yet. But I'm trying to get that biologically. So.
What are your thoughts on surface applied nitrogen at planting?
It depends. Is it going to rain tomorrow? Is it going to rain in the next 2 days? Do you have agritane on it?
What if you put ahead of your
help
drag
it?
chains and just get a little dirt over it?
Yeah, it's not going to make any difference.
No, it's
Might
still,
even be detrimental.
yeah, that actually could be detrimental, because you think about where your urease enzymes are, and they're right there at the under the thatch and right in the top inch of soil, and that's what's breaking down your nitrogen. So I don't mind surface applied. If I'm going to do surface applied nitrogen, I'm going to do it with urea with agritane on it, so I don't wet down all my residue and burn it up.
Yeah, if you want to apply fertilizer with the planter, of course, pop-up is almost mandatory in my opinion, unless, well, I think it is. No caveats there. But if you want to put more of your N on with the planter, just stream it on the surface near the row unit, like Tom was doing with dry, or a lot of people have liquid with tubes running a couple inches away from the row. I don't have any problem with that. It's a lot less destructive to your mulch cover than running that opener through there. And as far as loss concerned, like I said, it's 5 to 10% more efficient putting it in the ground. You just can't afford to do it. So we either do liquid streams on the surface or broadcast urea with or without your agritane, just depending on what our weather is doing. We've got one here. We'll hold that thought. So we need this row unit to stay at depth. And the more years you're in no-till in this part of the world, the more challenging that becomes. We always hear about, well, the soil's eventually going to mellow, and I guess I haven't quite seen that yet. It helps to have cover crops in there, no doubt. But until you've gotten a couple of cycles through with cover crops, these soils get hard and dry pretty easily, and it takes a lot of force. And so these springs on here, the heavy-duty ones, they're applying 400, maybe 450 if you're a little nose up. Airbags don't supply near that much. They top out about 3 1/4. Have trouble with your planter with airbags staying in the ground? That's why. So you can buy these assist springs that go on the outside of the linkage. This is like the old 7000s had, a lot of them. Some small coil springs on the outside of the linkage. In fact, I think Yetter still sells a kit like that. So you add a couple of those on there, and I think you can get about 180 pounds of downforce out of those. So added to your 3 1/4, now you're back up and running again. Certainly not excessive. I could see needing more at times. Hydraulic downforce, well, you've got gobs. And if you're trying to automate downforce, I strongly encourage you to skip the airbags and go straight to hydraulic. It reacts hundreds of times faster. Airbags, you're halfway across the field by the time the silly thing adjusts.
Yeah, I agree. I run them.
Yeah.
I run airbags, and it's on that, whatever they call it. I don't remember what the name is it for John Deere's system. And it is, it's just another tool you can look at, but you certainly can't rely on it. You can't. It's just so slow. So slow.
Now, one thing that airbags do is they eliminate the bounce. Springs bounce, airbags don't. So if you're having trouble with that, they can be a plus.
Mm-hmm.
They're easier to adjust. You can adjust them from the cab on the go, all that fun stuff.
You just max them out and go plant.
Yeah, max them out with your helper springs
unless
on.
it's this wet. If it's this wet, we won't max them out. But if we've got some dry soil at the surface, we pretty well max them out and plant.
Do you have the assist springs?
No. If it's that dry, I just stop. If it's that hard,
We
I
don't
stop.
have that luxury.
I stop. I stop and wait. I'd rather not. The seeds, I keep talking about how expensive seed is. That drives me nuts. But I'll just stop planting. If I can't get it in with what I've got, then I don't plant. I'll wait. We have a much longer growing season though. You know, we have guys planting soybeans from April to the end of July. I mean, that's not what I call the ideal on each end of that, but that's how, isn't that right? I mean, we've got a super long planting season.
I highly doubt airbags could hold depth even in this field right now, maxed out. I don't
Really?
think they could.
Really?
Your soils, even your upland soils, must be more forgiving. Yeah, Glenn?
Are you familiar with John Deere's, like he was talking about the active downforce, where they're measuring the load on the seed wheels or on the gauge wheels? If you are, how much weight do you like to run on the gauge wheels?
The margin on the Deere Seed Star systems, the margin has to be at least 80 to make the silly thing work right. In fact, a lot of times we run 200, 150 to 200.
I run 200 almost all the time on ours.
Now the precision planting is different. Precision planting, the margin numbers don't need to be near that high.
Yeah, I don't think you'd be running 200 on your downforce margin. You'd be talking 200 on the airbag pressure.
No, we're talking
on the
200 margin.
On the margin?
On the
Yes.
margin on our deer, we run 200 most of the
A
time.
lot of people run that way.
Can you get 1 year out of your gauge wheel arms?
Oh yeah,
Yeah, our gauge wheel arms are fine.
yeah, they're fine.
If we
because
didn't run that pressure, everything would wear faster because it'd be chattering going
they
through the
chatter and
field.
bounce. And that's another
Let me guess,
tip.
are you from Nebraska or someplace really mild? Okay. You don't understand, and lucky you. You don't have to deal with the crap soils we have here.
I will say this, talking about the chatter, there is nothing better than getting my kid or somebody else that works for me in the tractor, and I'm out here on a four-wheeler when we're setting it. And this is every field. I get out here on a four-wheeler and I'm going to cruise along, and I'll help the person decide how fast we're going to go, because it'll vary so much. There's times whenever the ground gets a little hard and I don't have the assist springs, we'll plant at 3 miles an hour, trying to make sure we're holding depth. And if we have to go slower than that, that's whenever we stop. But we don't ever plant over 5 miles an hour, ever. Even though I got airbags, I'm not getting bounce. But you can watch. You can get back here and watch, and that tells me a lot about whether or not I'm maintaining my depth with a four-wheeler, following along. And, you know, a couple passes, and you can learn a lot. And you can check every row.
If you had assist springs, you could drive faster and get a lot more done.
Well, probably so. Probably good.
And a GoPro.
Yeah. Actually, I've got a magnet on my phone. I don't have it with me. A great tool. You can set that different places around on a drill or whatever, and you can watch it plant. With a magnet on your phone, you hit record and off you go, and you can watch that row unit specifically. If you got one that has a problem, I've got a magnet on. It's called a Steely. It also sticks on my dash whenever I'm trying to find a farm. But if I'm watching directions, but you can stick that thing different places, and it works really good. It's really slick how you can really watch a row unit or a problem area.
Remind us again, Tom, where you farm at.
North Central Oklahoma. Very, very hot. Very hot. We get really, you all do too, but
He doesn't farm the worst soils in Oklahoma.
No,
Because I've
it's
seen
good.
those. Those are over in Grant County.
yeah. No, we have good soils. We have fairly deep soils for Oklahoma. They're pretty deep. And they have mellowed over the years. They've become more mellow the longer we're in no-till.
So, as to actually cutting the furrow, we talked a little bit about the blades, keeping them sharp. The gauge wheels, Well, blades. 3.5 millimeter blades are preferred. 3 is too thin, they flex too much in no-till. 4 is too thick, they don't flex enough. A little flex is good. The gauge wheels are more important than just gauging depth. We will probably never be using sonar or something like that to figure out how deep to plant, because this gauge wheel holds the sidewall together as the blades come up out of the soil. You've got to have something there. Otherwise, that sidewall is blowing apart at about the same time the seed is trying to get to the bottom of the furrow. And depending on how loose the soil is, you've got all kinds of stuff cracking, tumbling, falling everywhere you don't want. You want a crisply defined furrow, because the seed tube ends 2 inches above the bottom of the furrow. The only thing guiding it into position is the integrity of the sidewall. We actually have to compact the sidewall to get good seed placement. There is no way around it. You take the gauge wheels off, what do you have? You have a big rooster tail of soil blowing out. That's sidewall blowout. If you have an RID gauge tire that's indented up next to the blade, you don't see the rooster tail, but that lifting action is still occurring. It's lifting and getting knocked right back down, just like you had a little deflector there. Well, your seed placement's all messed up with those RID gauge tires. You don't want them.
I've had as much as 20% of my seed if I don't have enough down pressure and we're getting that lifting, because whenever that lifts, it creates a void, and that seed will go into that void and won't be in the bottom of your V. It'll be to the side and up under, maybe 1/4 inch, maybe even as far as 1 inch away from the middle of your V.
Yep. And guess what? They're not engaged by the keton, so they don't get firmed. And they try to germinate under that sidewall, and they'll spiral around instead of coming up, so it's wasted seed.
Yeah.
So,
or worse, it's a weed, because they come up late.
Yeah. So, yeah, even you have the correct shape of gauge wheel on there, but if you don't have enough down pressure to keep it firmly on the soil surface, you're going to have some of those same effects with sidewall blowout. That's why I insist the depth of the furrow must be constant. That is imperative. You'll never do a good job placing seed without doing a little bit of compacting of that sidewall and having a nice clean cut V to guide the seed into position. We also need the gauge wheel shimmed up tight to the blade. I don't care what it's doing at the front of the blade. I care what it's doing where the blade is exiting the soil, back here. That's where I look to shim, what it's doing at the back. If it's touching at the back and gapped at the front, don't matter. If it's a huge gap, all right, your gauge arm is bent. But if you have it touching at the front and it's still gapped at the back, replace the gauge arm. That gauge wheel must be up against the blade to have good seed placement. And the dustier it is, or the shallower you're planting, the more critical this is. You have to hold that sidewall down while the seed goes to where it needs to be. As little as 1/8 of an inch gap there lets more dust come blowing up, falling in ahead of the seed. It's really, really critical when it's dry.
Yeah, that's what I ran into with cotton. Yeah, it is a problem.
So next we come to the firming and closing steps. And I'm kind of an old geezer. I was around no-till in 90, 91. We didn't have all this wonderful technology. Now, I was up in South Dakota at the time on the family farm, and the soils up there are just incredibly forgiving. Every time I go back up there, I'm agog. It's just so nice. Everything works. And then I got to go back to Kansas and deal with these soils. Or worse, Grant County, Oklahoma.
Yeah, that is worse.
There is worse. Well, we didn't have ketons back in the early 90s. And this has probably been the single biggest technology for improving planters in no-till. You know, Tom was saying, well, you know, give me a stock unit that's well maintained. I'm like, well, you know, there are some things that we did that were pretty major. The Keaton and the mojo wire on the Keaton were the two single biggest things we ever did for planters and no-till. Because we're firming right down there where it needs to be. These old style wheels, they're made for tillage. It's all dried out, you destroyed the structure, you compact it all back down, the seed grows. But out here, they're not doing anything at seed depth unless you crank this all the way up to like 100 pounds of pressure. And then you're starting to lift your row unit and do other bad things. You can't spare that. But even if you stacked enough weight on here to be able to do that, to even consistently get 5 pounds of pressure down here around the seed, you're applying inordinate amounts of pressure up here. It might take 100 pounds at the surface to get 5 down here. So you've severely compacted everything where you want roots to grow. And we had terrible tomahawk rooting back in the day because we didn't have spoke closing wheels, we didn't have Keatons. So to get seed to soil contact, we were running these and we'd crank the pressure all the way up. We had to close the furrow, we had to get some sort of seed to soil contact. All right, so you got a stand, but all the roots would grow right down that furrow. They couldn't get through the sidewall. These are the worst for creating sidewall compaction. It's not the gauge wheels. The gauge wheel does some damage, but these, with the pressure cranked up, are vastly worse for causing sidewall compaction. So we're able, with the Keaton and with spoke closing wheels, to separate out those functions. Now, with the Keaton, we're just applying a few pounds of pressure, but it's right where it's needed. We're not compacting everything up here where we want roots to grow and we want the shoot to come up through. Just a few pounds right down here. And Keaton technology has come a long way since they first came out in 94, 95. These new quick attach, they're amazing. These brackets are robust. They last more than a year.
Yeah.
They last quite a long time. Replacing the tail is so easy. You just do that. You no longer have a tensioning screw, which is a little bit of a downside, but these have enough pressure where they're not too bad. But still, I'll show you some evidence a little bit later when we look at the plots that you really want a mojo wire on here, unless you're planting in tilled conditions. Then you may not need it. But if you do any no-till at all, you really want that mojo wire. This is the single biggest thing we ever did for planters in no-till. So there's some other options out there for seed firming in the furrow. There's these called the Flow Right. How many of you have heard of them? Yeah. They never really took off to a large extent. It's a cool idea. They have harder plastic here and the springiness up here, and this little part was replaceable. But it runs into other problems because mud wants to gather here where this juncture is. So it was a cool idea, but ultimately it really didn't pan out. And now that the quick attach tails are so easy to replace, we do that.
What about the low profile tails?
Okay, good question on the low profile tails. I hate them. The idea with the low profile tails, well, there's less place for mud to accumulate. Well, that's true, but if you just put a mojo wire on there and cut a clean furrow ahead of that, you won't have mud accumulating anyway. You know, all this stuff about mud accumulating on Keatons derives from two things. The Keaton doesn't have enough pressure to hold itself down in the furrow and wipe itself clean against the sidewall, or you've done too much disturbance ahead of your opener with coulters, or you've got RID gauge tires, you're digging, something up there is doing too much disturbance. If you've got a nice clean furrow and the firming device has enough pressure to stay down in there and wipe itself clean, you'll never have trouble with mud. Well, maybe not never. There are some gooey enough soils that maybe you'll have trouble. But those soils really don't exist around here. And Tom has some insight on when to replace Keaton tails.
all the time.
But
You do replace them often.
you don't wait until it gets
Absolutely
up
not.
here.
Absolutely not. Whenever you get down where you see this angle right here, once it gets where this angle is down into here, it's time to replace them. So I'd say if you get a ½ inch of wear, they're wore out. It's time to replace them.
And you're looking at what the shape is
Right,
down here. When
right.
this becomes like a
Right.
ship's keel,
Right, then
it's
it,
pushing seeds off to the
then
side
it's not
instead
working
of pushing
anymore. It
them
needs to
down.
stay flat on the bottom. Because if it doesn't, it will do exactly that. You got to think about what you've got. You've got a seed laying there, just sitting there on top of the ground, and it's round. So if you've got a sharp mojo right there, Keaton, then it's going to push it to the side and it's not going to push it down like it's supposed to.
Compare those two, flat versus
Exactly.
shaped like a ship's keel.
And it doesn't take long before you lose that.
Do you replace your Keatons as often as your discs on your planter?
More often.
More often.
Yeah.
So 6 times this year or something?
Oh, not twice as often, but I probably go through 3 or 4 sets of Keatons and 2 sets to 3 sets of blades a year. We're doing quite a few acres though. We do some custom, but not very much anymore. Used to do a whole lot of custom, but that's before everybody had their own planters and their own drills. But you can get an awful lot of acres on a well-maintained planter or drill. I mean, 100,000 acres on a drill is not too many. If you just do the maintenance on it. Yes.
How fast you drive it on?
No more than 5. Especially with my drill and, well, both of them. I don't ever go more than 5 miles an hour, ever. That's our top speed. We really feel like we're getting after it if we're running 5. I know that that's not common, but that's what we do. I just went to a wider planter so I could get over enough acres. What do you think about speed and planting?
As long as we have enough down pressure, you can do whatever you want. I have a lot of guys that run 7 to 8 miles an hour with their drill, or faster.
Really?
If you got enough down pressure, it's fine.
Well, I'm scared of that. But, you know, let's say, for instance, on soybean seed, we plant with a drill no more than really 100,000, maybe 105,000 per acre. With a planter, it's 85 or 90,000. So we keep our rates pretty low. But, you know, my beans still look good right now.
What's your spacing on your drill?
30.
On your drill, what?
Oh, on my drill, 10. 10 inch spacing.
The faster you drive, you gotta have more down pressure, don't you?
Yes.
Yes.
And that's why he's saying he slows clear down to 3 miles an hour with the planter when they're having trouble maintaining depth.
Yeah.
And that's a valid technique.
It's not as efficient. I guess I need to add some springs. I've got enough weight on it. I do know I have enough weight. I could add springs and be fine.
And that's a good point right there. You start adding more ways of transferring pressure, transferring that weight off of the toolbar. You got to make sure you have enough on the toolbar to begin with, or you just lift the toolbar. You don't want to be in the upper. You don't want that way up in the air, because then you don't have much range in your parallel link, and you're not accomplishing what you set out to, which is have more down pressure on the row unit.
We got a little behind on our burn down, which isn't common, but we did this year. And so I found out this year that I do not have enough weight on my drill. I'm going to have to add more suitcase weights. And that was, I actually rotated some from the front of the drill to the back, because the location's so much better. Because whenever you get a lot of down pressure on a John Deere drill anyway, your back tires will come off the ground. So I started adding more weight to the back, and I need, my gosh, I'll probably add another 1,000 pounds per wing to the back, right over the top of those back running tires. Right over the top of those, I'll probably put another 1,000 pounds on each wing before I plant this fall.
On your Keatons for basically in-furrow fertilizer, is there an advantage whether running your fertilizer through the Keaton as opposed to that seed tube guard?
No, they end up in the same place. The question was, does it matter whether you run fertilizer through the seed tube guard or through the Keaton? No, they both end up in the bottom of the furrow.
Basically, if you run it with the seed tube guard, then you're coming along and smearing the seed into it with the Keaton then.
That's why I'm not a huge fan of putting it through the guard, is because I have more stuff, I have that sticky stuff wanting to adhere to the Keaton once I drag it through the fertilizer. So I'm quite happy putting it, to me this is the ideal place to put your pop-up through that. But, you know, we make the Valiants with the liquid tube for the people that can't stand Keatons or hate those tubes running back there.
It's a good backup when the tube wears the whole side of it.
But agronomically, there doesn't seem to be any difference, both in the same place. Now we had the question about the furrow jet, which, oh, here it is. This device from Precision Planting, the furrow jet, it can deliver 3 streams of fertilizer. One right down in the seed row, which is your pop-up, and then they've got these wings out here which are slicing through the sidewall and shooting fertilizer into that sidewall. So you can apply quite a bit more and have safety. And you can rig these so you run a different mix or a different rate in furrow versus through the wings. And when these first came out, I was really skeptical. I thought, well, you know, how's this all going to work? Is this going to lift the whole row unit or what? No, this is spring-loaded, so you'll never lift the row unit. And then I thought, well, this flimsy little thing, how's that ever going to do enough seed firming? Well, it does. Partly because it's tucked so far down in there, but also you're getting a little bit of pinching action with these little wings back there. So the seed firming is really quite good with these. You got to replace these little guys. Obviously, they don't last a real long time, no bigger than they are. So everything is good in that regard. It's really cool technology, but in the real world, there are some issues. The biggest one's probably mud. It's one more thing for mud to sit on top of and pack into your gauge wheels and things like that. That's probably the biggest downfall of them. If you don't have mud, well, you might like them very well. And this part seems to shed mud okay. The other thing is they're another place for stalks to catch. In fact, the company says if you run the open rim gauge wheels, do not run these. And I had a guy ignore that and do it anyway, and he ran 1 year and they're off of there. But it's one more, those spokes, those stalks come spearing through those spokes and lodge into this, and then everything wants to bulldoze and so forth. So it has limitations in the real world, and as more and more of you go to the open rim gauge wheels, you're probably not going to want this. And if you plant in significant mud at all, beware. I guess I got a little bit ahead of myself talking about seed firming and didn't talk about the guards. This is another thing that we sort of discovered by accident. Phil Kester of RK Products came out with a guard that had more wear area and so forth, and this was late 90s, early 2000s, somewhere in there. Keith Thompson had 5 of these scattered across his 16-row planter, just randomly across there. And I was out there kind of late in the summer, and his double crop corn had tasseled, and he said, so which 5 rows is it? And I'm like, well, it's that one, that one, that one. They were 10 inches taller versus slightly worn OEM guards. So getting more seeds deeper late in the season, depth matters. So those plants were more robust, being placed a little bit deeper and more consistent with a full width guard. And also the stand was a little bit better, so they competed a little bit more and grew a little bit taller. But it matters a lot to have this guard full width. And the OEM ones, one of my sales reps is fond of saying they must be made out of bubble gum, but they last, a day or two in no-till, and they're getting bad. you can't get a season out of them. No way. Once they get down to about 5/8 of an inch, you've got too much flex. They are the backstop to prevent blade flex. If you have too much blade flex, that furrow gets so pinched at the bottom that you can't get a seed down to it. At least not anything the size of a corn kernel. And worse, as you go along through the field, that soil density varies. So your amount of flex varies. What's that do to your effective depth? It varies. You can watch a Keaton running in a furrow with a worn out guard, and that Keaton in relation to the soil surface, it's doing this as you go along. The seed is right at the bottom of that Keaton, so that's how much your depth is varying. It's just crazy. Now, we don't want the furrow excessively wide. That's just creating more sidewall compaction, makes it harder to close, harder to get roots to grow, all those things. But we can't have it getting too narrow. And somewhere around 5/8 of an inch or a smidge under that, certainly by the time you get to a 1/2 inch, things are not going well. This is an OEM guard. It's completely shot. Notice the sides of this are curved. That's how much your blades are flexing. So to prevent that blade flex, RK Products had theirs that was kind of expensive and didn't last quite as long as we'd like. There were a number of iterations. He had floating wear pads and all this really complicated stuff. I kept telling them, well, hey, could you just cast the thing out of high chrome and make this thing affordable and not so complicated? And he never did, so finally I got permission to do it from him, and so we came out with our Valium, the chrome version, which lasts probably 2.5 times longer than an OEM guard, depending on your brand. White guards aren't as bad as Deere and Kinsey. Kinsey seems to be the worst. And then I was hoping to get even longer wear life than that. I'm the kind of guy that's like, can't we make this stuff so it lasts forever? I really hate turning wrenches. So we came out with one with tungsten carbide tiles inlaid into it that we call our Ultra, and these really will last forever. Unless you have bad rocks and you beat the tiles off with rocks. But
or you break row units or something like that. So it has to be catastrophic before you're going to tear one of those up. It really does. This is just to show you where we've come. This is an old JS Ag guard, and this was one of the things that they were doing to try to minimize sidewall blowout, or keep the sidewall was still blowing out, but keep it out of the furrow. So they welded these big wings on here. Well, eventually that wore ultra thin, and it would start folding in. It would even plug up. But that's where we've come from. The liquid channel through here, it drops in the same place as a totally tubular, so we borrowed that from them. So if you like the placement with totally tubular, we do the same thing. We've got heat resistant tubing that goes through here, otherwise the stuff melts. That's how much heat is being generated in no-till. Replace your seed tubes if they start getting frayed at the bottom. I think seed tube technology has come a long way. These newer, harder plastics are doing a lot better. But if you keep your guard in good shape, you never get those tubes wearing the sides off anymore. So then it's just a matter of, do they get too much pitting inside, which the soft black plastic would get a lot of pitting. The newer, harder plastics are doing a lot better. They're slicker too. Seems slicker.
So where we've come from on closing wheels, I said we didn't have anything in the early 90s, but by about that time, 93 or so, we had two designs come to the market. This one was invented by Walter Carroll, and marketed as the Acra plant, and Dawn has had them for, I don't know, close to 20 years now, called the Curve Tine. I mentioned the long, skinny spoke row cleaners. Howard Martin got the idea, well, we should use that for a row cleaner. In fact, so much engineering went into it that it's the same part number. It's the exact same thing as a row cleaner, as his row cleaner wheel. And they actually don't work that bad. We'll see the results. Tom ran them.
I ran them for years. I did this back whenever I got my first planter, well, my second planter, my first 12 row. And I did this. I had 6 different closing systems on them and ran it for a season. And then did stand counts. And at that time, in my early no-till, with some pretty tough clays that we had, I ended up going with the Martin spiked closing wheels for a few years. And as I got to know Matt better, he kept saying, well, try the Thompsons again, try them again. And as my no-till soils kind of, I would say, started to mature, they're nowhere near there yet, but as they started to mature, I switched to some Thompsons, and I was blown away by the different job that they did now than they did 6, 7 years earlier. You know, it was amazing contrast, and I switched them all, went all to Thompsons at that time. And I do love them. I've got them on my drill, my planter. I've worn out a set. It's time for new ones. But to Matt's credit and to Leah's credit, I tried to replace all of them last year, and because they just didn't look at all new anymore, they were sharp, and the little points were getting shorter, and they said no, it should still perform very well. You talked me out of buying new ones then. You won't this year, because now they are really wore out. But I do love them, especially on my drill. That's amazing how much different that machine is now compared to what it was with the cast closing wheels on it. It's a completely different machine. But I did the same test, and some of these on here I used. Those that you're standing next to were absolutely the worst. Not the Spikes, those.
The Schlegels.
Schlegels.
And they're the worst in the test.
They sound terrible, even. Just saying the word Schlegel. They just sound like they're not going to, and they did not work. They were,
No.
hope there's not a
They
rep
keep
here.
changing the design of them. They changed it a myriad times. I mean, they used to have this little foot was sticking out on this side as well. And, I don't know, they keep changing it, but it's terribly ineffective. You just have these little feet walking along, making chicken tracks on top of the ground. They're not doing any sidewall breakage. They hardly get the furrow closed unless you crank the pressure way up. And you can see from your sheet, 3 years of stand counts, they're by far the worst. In fact, I always tell people almost any spoke closing wheel will probably perform better than a smooth OEM, with the exception of Schlegel, which is
The worst.
why spend the money? They're really just pretty worthless.
There was another one I kind of liked, but it fell apart. I didn't get a half a season out of them, but I'm not even going to mention them, but they were terrible. They worked pretty good. The design wasn't terrible, but they just wouldn't hold together.
And they
So
last.
they lasted half a season, fell apart. So I ended up switching them out and buying the Martins. But when I first did this, I contacted a few reps and a few companies, and all this stuff was given to me to try. So I really didn't have a bias on any of them. I didn't know you very well at the time. And so it was fun. I enjoyed doing that kind of stuff. But I never put a pencil to how much it cost me not running the right stuff all the way across, but I'm sure it was significant. It's just, this is like the 5th time I've said it, seed costs are too expensive to compromise on this step. And then and even seed costs, if you're going to get a great yield, are not that big a deal, but that's just it. If it cost you 5 bushels an acre, 10 bushels an acre, then how much did it cost to not have sharp disc and adequate closing and a good mojo wire on your Keaton? 5 bushels an acre over 6,000 or 8,000 acres, all of a sudden is huge expense.
And for some of this basic stuff, I'm not talking about the fanciest, but some of the basic things, if your budget just you don't see how you're going to pay for basic maintenance and some really essential upgrades, just go over to your seed budget and take equal dollars off your seed budget, cut your seeding rates, and you'll have a
Amen.
better stand when you're done.
Amen. That is the truth. That's good stuff right there.
So this one here is a relative newcomer to the market. That's SI Distributing Finger Till. And the first time I saw it, I was like, hey, I like that. I like that shape. So I had him send a couple several years ago, and I went to pick it up out of the box, and I was like, oh, I don't like it too much anymore. Extremely heavy. Do a lot of packing, even without, even with just minimal pressure, they do a lot of packing. And yet they perform fairly well. These here are the furrow cruisers. They've gained a lot of popularity because, well, they're cheap, because you just bolt the little segments into your old wheel halves. And another thing I should point out about these larger diameter wheels is that you're getting some toe out, because it's altering that angle. By jacking the back of that bracket up, you're changing some of this into this. So the larger wheels inherently have some toe out, which is what we're doing with the toe out wedges on the Thompson wheels. The furrow cruisers, they wear out pretty fast and they collect a lot of mud because they're wide, as you might expect.
Well, that's a lot like the design of one of them that I kind of liked that fell apart really quick. And that, I don't know what the company is, they're out of business now, but they looked a little bit like that.
And we've got our Thompson wheels here with the toe out wedge. Back in the mid-90s, 95 or so, Dwayne Beck designed this wheel that's called the May West Star Wheel. And if you're fortunate, you probably never dealt with them. They closed the furrow quite nicely, but they fell apart really bad. They had cheap bearings in them. The Martin Spader bearings don't last all that long either. They're the same as OEM bearings, but I think May West cut some corners and used even cheaper ones than OEM and Martin. If you got phosphorus fertilizer anywhere near these aluminum hubs, they disintegrated. Mm-hmm. So we were trying to fix the bearing problem, which necessitated a different hub and all this, just to get the wheel ring. The only part we liked was the shape of the spokes. And Keith and Ben Thompson, the people that the Thompson wheel is named for, they were working with all these different shapes, concave wheels, and all these different things. And I told them, just make them flat, guys. And they had all these different shapes of spokes, real long, skinny ones, and short, blunt ones. And I said, just trace the outline on that May West wheel, make it out of flat plate. I think you have something. That pretty much is how the Thompson wheel came about. We were so sick of changing bearings in those May West wheels that we came up with the Thompson wheel. And we didn't even care if it didn't do quite as good a job. We were that sick of changing bearings. But lo and behold, it does a better job. It penetrates a little easier, breaks the sidewall more, and it stays cleaner. I would never have guessed that the steel sheds mud better than the poly, but it's due to the shape. When it's real narrow like that, there's no place for the mud to collect. And yeah, if it gets horrendously muddy and you shouldn't be out there, yeah, you can ball them up. Or if it's first year no-till. But after a year or two of no-till, you're running on a thatch, your soils are getting a little more organic matter in that surface, they stay pretty clean. Along with that, we changed the OEM springs. That OEM spring is intended to do a lot of packing. That was your seed to soil contact in your tilled soil. So they exert a great deal of force. I forget the exact number, but I think it's over 80 pounds. Well, that's way too much for any of these spoked wheels, because you've got a lot smaller area on engaging the soil, a lot smaller surface area. So we, along with various other companies, offer a lighter spring to go in there. So now you've got some adjustment again. Otherwise, You see some of these have these carriage bolts in there. We were trying to make a lighter setting for OEM, but that OEM spring, as you're going through the field, that OEM spring went from 0 to a hell of a lot in about that much movement. And so it really it wasn't a good deal. So the lighter spring helps a bunch. I usually get the question about drag chains, so I'll just head that off right now. If you do a good job with furrow closing, you don't need a drag chain. If you want to run them, fine. I don't care. To me, it's just one more thing to trip over when you're trying to fill your seed hoppers, because they're feel good. They'll kind of drag some stuff around and make it look like you did a better job closing the furrow, but in reality, it's just masking the problem. You'll think you've closed the furrow, but until you dig and look, it just sifted some dust and duff over the top. It's not doing anything to break sidewall or actually get things over the top of the seed. Do you run drag chains?
No. I did when I had the Martin spike closing wheels, because there was a lot of chunks. I mean, they will really chunk it up.
I don't have any problem with them. I mean, one thing about drag chains is they make a smooth surface, so that you're going up a hill and you get torrential rains, it's a little more likely to run where you've smoothed it all out. Whereas if you got some little chunks, it's not as bad. But I really don't care whether you run row cleaner or drag chains or not.
What about a chevron wheel for behind the closing system?
You're talking about the Yetter makes this thing that comes way back and runs a chevron wheel. I like that idea. It's like they run almost no pressure on it. I love the idea, but try to tell anybody with a folding planter that they should run those. Yeah, it's kind of like a case, but it's just this huge arm that comes back, way back here, so that after you've chewed up the sidewall, you've got a little something patting it down and settling it. I always thought they were great, but anybody with a folding planter that's trying to get down between a narrow bridge or into their shed, they're not going to go for it. I guess one more thing. New technology. A year ago, well, 2 seasons ago, a company called Mud RX. Well, I don't know what the company name's called, but this is called Mud RX. It's a hard poly insert that goes in here. The idea is to let this scrape the blade, the mud off the blade a little bit better, and to preserve the wear here, so that you don't have, once this lip goes, you should scrap the wheel once that lip falls off of there or gets big chunks out of it. It's a beautiful concept, but again, in reality, it is not as great as you would think. For one thing, they're tremendously expensive, and for another, they were running some. I had one of my guys running some in North Dakota last year, and a year ago last spring, and they sort of worked on the planter, but on the deer drill, they absolutely could not make them work. They were mud was just creating problems, and I wasn't there. I never even saw pictures of the problem, but they flat could not make them work on the drill. So it's one of those things that you look at it and you think, well, gee, that ought to work, but it's maybe not. I would say try a few rows for a couple of years before you go whole hog in that. Also on gauge wheels, I love the open rim design. If you fight mud at all, or have a tendency to get a little too close to mud holes, those open rims are great. They all shed mud adequately. I mean, some of them have got 3 really skinny spokes versus Mud Smiths are a little bit wider. They all squish mud out adequately. I would go more based on the gauge tire itself. Deere's gauge tires are much too hard, and they've got a little relief, kind of a mini RID shape to them. I don't care for that at all. I think Mudsmith is a much better gauge wheel. We don't sell them. We don't get any kickback or anything. Mudsmith it's a 20% thicker tire. It's soft. Yeah, it's soft like these, which you want, some cushioning effect. But because they're 20% thicker, they'll go almost twice as long, and they've got the same shape. So, and you can put them on any rim. So if you're up for new gauge tires, I'd go with Mudsmith. If you're buying open rim gauge wheels, I'd go with Mudsmith.
In average, how often would you change the tires on the gauge wheels?
Just when they're
Whenever that lip, it depends on what you're running in. I mean,
soybean stuff, they're hard.
soybean stubble, that's like running razor blades. If you're never running, there's guys up north or out west that don't have any soybeans, their gauge wheels last forever. And then guys that we run in a lot in soybean stubble, and it just destroys them. You can make them last a little longer by letting them sit out in the sun for a year before you install them.
That helps.
I'm not joking.
It really does help. It's tougher.
It's just like tires on your tractor.
They don't chip out as bad.
They're not so soft. Yep, cured.
Yep. If you don't do that, then you end up having whole ribbons of that will peel out. If you let them harden, then you'll get little chunks out, and they'll last a little longer. But soybeans are just going to tear them up. They really do, especially if you're planting into some kind of dry soil and had pretty decent soybean crop. Then those things are so hard. You better have good boots too. I mean, poked holes in boots.
What do I think of Needham's urethane tires? They're probably okay up in the Dakotas, where they've got pretty good soil and don't fight the infiltration so much. Here, I'm a lot more reluctant to use them. I mean, yeah, they'll last 3 times longer, no doubt about it, but you give up that cushioning of the gauge wheel and the soil, and I think it's, like the difference between steel tractor rims versus tires. I think there's a difference there in how much you're compacting the soil. I don't have any proof of that, but I mean, it seems irrefutable logic to me.
A friend of mine does a lot of custom planting, and he runs them. So, because he can't afford to keep replacing these.
But he's also not.
And
if you're farming your own land, you're a lot. Yeah.
So he's out there running, 20,000 acres a year, pretty easy, with a drill, and he's got them on there, and he can run 2 years. He can probably put 40,000 acres on those things. They run a long time, but they are hard. Seeding rate.
Seeding rate for soybeans in north central Kansas, dryland. If your drill is in good condition, 115,000. And as you move, when you get down to Tom's area, I wouldn't plant more than 80,000 dryland in Oklahoma. There's no reason to, assuming your drill's in good condition.
I did a test last year, and I've done it a number of years, on irrigated ground where I planted 70,000, and then last year I think I did 90,000. Then I went with recommended for our area 140. There was 4 bushels per acre difference from the 70 to the 140, and there was no difference from the 90 to 140. The differences that I could see between the 70 and the 90, there were 4 bushels difference in yield. It was 70 and 74 bushels. The real difference was in the weed control. And we had more weeds in the 70, but there was no difference from 90 to 140. There was no difference. You couldn't tell.
All right, one more question, then we're going to take a break.
What was the difference in row spacing? You said you're planting with a 10-inch?
10-inch drill. I was planting them on 10 inches. And this year, by mistake, we planted our first 300 and some acres at about 70,000. Dryland. They look incredible. They're my best beans right now, dryland, because we're getting a little dry. And they look really good. So I kind of wish I'd have stayed there on all my dryland drilled ground. I really do.
I've had stands of 45,000 dryland beans just down here at Wyndham make over 80 bushel.
My stand counts were around 50 to 55,000, which is really good considering we dropped 70. I thought that was really good. The conditions weren't ideal when we were planting. So.
So there's the seed. I haven't disturbed it any. You can see that it's stuck in there quite well. I'm not knocking it loose when I'm doing this, flicking it. It's really embedded. That's what we want to see with that Keaton and Mojo. We want a lot of pressure on there. It's taken quite there. I finally moved it. I had to push pretty hard. Now, checking depth. We go to the top of the seed, to the original soil line, like this. On me, it's very easy. This knuckle right here is 2 inches. So like that. So we're exactly 2 inches, which is where we want to be. We'll talk a little bit about planting depth when we get to looking at our plots over here. But with corn, it's pretty crucial that you be at least 2 inches deep. So here where it was pretty muddy, we weren't getting a lot of sidewall breakage. We were getting some. It was chewing this up right here, but this is really wetter than you would plant. Right here in this swale. We go back out there where it was a little more mellow, and it would be doing a better job of breaking it. Just chewed up this sidewall pretty good. This one, maybe not quite as much. It's doing a little chunking.
The question earlier was, what's wrong with this SI distributing one? Well, it's doing a little more packing, which you can't really tell right now. You won't know until the soil is dried out, and then you'll know for sure how much sidewall compaction you really have. We want these, if we were adjusting this now, I would probably run a little bit more pressure or a little more toe out on these Thompson wheels. You can see up here, well, let's move back where it's a little drier.
So I like to be able to just move this loose soil out of the way with my finger. You don't really have to dig. I don't need any hard object to dig with. This last little bit I'll clean out with a pen that's dyed or a pliers handle, screwdriver, anything like that. So here's the bottom of the furrow. And we're getting quite a bit of squeezing action there from those Thompsons, so maybe they don't need any more pressure. There's the seed right there. And it was tucked in so well that I felt it before I saw it. I was scraping the bottom of the furrow and my pen bounced over that. You guys really have to come around behind me to see it, but it's squished in there thoroughly. It's embedded in the bottom of the furrow.
Does this plant have Keatons with Mojo wires on every row?
There's Keaton and Mojo wires on every row except as noted. All of them have Keatons, but there's at least one row that doesn't have Mojos on it. The closing wheel comparison, those all have Mojos. So as far as sidewall breakage, we'd like to see a little bit more. I'd like to chew this up down here like that, but without disrupting seed placement. It's doing a little bit better right here. This is all torn loose. And even with it digging an 1 3/4 inches deep, it still hasn't disrupted this seed placement here.
Because the Keaton and Mojo have squished it in that well. There's just this tiny little bit of furrow sidewall remaining right there. You can see the furrow. The Thompson wheel has dug all this out. So those wheels are actually set about right.
I would say that if you're, as you change depth, as you change from, let's say, milo to soybeans, or from cotton to corn or something like that, you do have to make adjustments many times to your toe-out wedges. You can't just assume that they're set perfect for everything you plant, because as you go deeper, it takes a little different, sidewall breaking, and then as moisture changes, there are adjustments to be made. I think that a lot of people would set them, and they would be adequate for everything. But if you're going to really fine tune it, like Matt said, one side the toe out might be just right, the other side might need a little bit more toe out to it, or less. So the important thing is to know that your seed's in the bottom of the trench, it's even, and that it's firmly packed into the bottom. That's number one, and then you got to work on getting the sidewalls broke up.
And if you don't change depths drastically, like going super shallow for cotton, then you don't need to change toe out. And there's a lot of people that run that toe out wedge at 3 degrees, half, and we do all the adjustment just with spring pressure from thereafter. And it's a pretty good happy medium for all the different soil types, from bottomland to tough upland.
I will say this, the Thompsons do work really well on different soil types. Unless you just go to a pure sugar sand from a Lila clay, then you'd obviously have to take some pressure off. But most of the time, they perform well across different soil types.
Speaking of sugar sand, is there a problem in those kind of soil conditions that the Thompson's going in too deep?
Yes. They can go too deep. If it's just pure, it's almost blow sand, they can go too deep. They're not the closing wheel for that circumstance. That's about the only thing I've seen where I would not recommend them. We obviously don't recommend them for tilled environments either. There's a lot of people that, if you need to plant a field or two of tilled along with your no-till, they'll work adequately, but I certainly wouldn't choose them if you were predominantly tilled. Now, if you don't have any questions on seed placement, we'll go look at these plots.
I'll ask one question. So this is the end of May, and we're planting. Maybe just a little drier than this, but now we have 2 weeks of 105, the wind's howling, we're west of Hayes. And we've had trouble with these stilled up enough, but the clods are hard enough.
It crusts or it dries?
Well,
the crust where the shoot will bend back over.
You just take that cloth and lay it on top there.
So after it's rained, or if it doesn't rain?
If it don't rain, and you plant like this, I mean, it'd be a little dry, but still we have trouble with the crust if we get that week of hot dry.
It's like clod turns into a brick.
Right, and the coleoptile doesn't want to come around it. Yes, there will be some of that with the Thompson wheels.
So how you get over that?
We don't.
What's your estimate in, say, stand reduction due to that?
Well, it depends on how many clods you have. But I mean, if you're long-term no-till with good mulch cover, it doesn't seem to be a significant factor.
These are 20-year no-till fields.
Okay. You're not cleaning.
They're actually very firm.
Are you cleaning much out of the row?
We're not running any cleaners.
Yeah, they will do some chunking, as will a lot of these other closing wheels.
One of those wheels you was talking about that come on the back, would that help that maybe?
Oh yeah. If you can run one of those chevron wheels over the top, that would break that clod.
That would help a lot.
Yeah.
In that scenario, it sure would. I know that if I've got that kind of forecast, I'll go deeper on my planting depth too. I do. I'm not scared to plant soybeans 2 inches deep, 3 inches wheat on wheat.
I mean, on that top portion of it, and it's dried out, and your seed's that far below in your slot, that just gets hard and it can't hardly come up through there.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It will do that, and that is one of the downfalls of the Thompson wheel. Some of these others will probably, like the finger till, will mash that up a little better, but it's always a trade-off of compacting versus not. What's the greater
The
evil?
Martin spiked were worse on having these clods. They have tons of them. That's why I ran the drag chain on those, just to help break those up a little bit. And you feel better when you look behind it and it's all smooth and pretty. But I don't run those anymore.
What depth have you planted soybeans at?
I've actually planted them at 3 inches deep. If we've got a dry, hot forecast and moisture's 1.5 inches down, I want it down into the moisture another inch. That's what I do.
So would it help to
Plant
move
deep.
them wheels closer together so it doesn't yank up such a big clump and almost unbury the seed? Because that's what I did with mine on my Kinsey. I put them real close together, and it helps, but I don't get the...
Yeah, you don't break up the sidewall as well. Yeah. There's always trade-offs on these. The perfect closing system has yet to be invented. But planted with that exact setup over there, we have not changed any settings whatsoever. These were all planted going north. So there's one on each side that were planted more recently. I'm going to talk about this one because it's maybe a little easier to see what's going on. And really, visually, you won't see a huge amount. You got to count. And I counted these. I counted the leaves on every plant to decide whether to include it in the count or not. Because I wanted it based on, where those plants slowed at all from too much packing around them, where they slowed from being misplaced. Now the exact rains that occurred here hid some things that normally are more pronounced. We had 1,500ths of rain the day after we planted these, if I'm remembering correctly, one day after. And so 1,500ths will soak down an 1.5 inches or so in these soils. Since it had rained, this was planted damp. It was bone dry. We had 2 inches of rain. Yay, we can go put our plots in. So it was damp, but certainly not muddy like it would be in the spring, because the moisture is just draining so fast. So it was moist, mellow, but certainly not muddy. That 1,500ths of rain soaked down, and so any of these shallow place seeds germinated from that 1,500ths of rain. So, like row number 12, which if you looked at the planter, row 12 is hardly even going in the ground. Most of the keton's showing above the furrow. And that would be just a complete disaster if it didn't rain on it. It is a disaster anyway from a yield standpoint, but it would be visually much more stark. Last year, we didn't have any rain after planting. So if you look at your sheet here, 2017 Stansbury, you look at some of those with, like row 12, it had only a 33% stand count. And this one over here that row 8 that had very little down pressure, it had only 22% stand count. So the beauty of doing this number of years is we get to average out a lot of things. And your 3-year average there is in the far column in green. Everything's converted to a percent. On the early planting here, it was just peeking through, so I was able to just go along and count. I didn't have to actually count leaves on that, unlike this painstaking process here. So those two are averaged to go into the 3-year average. In other words, we're not counting this year twice in that 3-year average. These get averaged together, and then that goes in with the previous 2 years. So looking at what happened this year, these stands, we're looking at the early planting here. the row number 1 had 67% emergence. And you go to looking along here, and it's like, yeah, these plants are delayed a little. These plants are delayed, that plant's delayed. There's some that are missing from soil being too dense. It's not obvious how bad it is, but 67% of maximum. It's certainly not great. So the next one over is the dawn curve tine. Everything else is the same. So just by changing out closing wheels, we went from 67 to 92. Huge difference. And you can see on the late planting, it did about the same thing. It jumped from 70 to 89. The third row, the Martin spaders, dropped off to 79 on this early planting. It was actually 89 on the late planting. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but I guess more data is good. We average that all together. You can see that OEM, in the 3-year average, OEM is not very good. 67% of maximum. That is a lot of wasted seed. That is a lot of weeds that are emerging late. It's not even going to yield anywhere near what it should because of the sidewall packing and the tomahawk rooting. Now, last year and the year before, I could show you the tomahawk rooting really well. But because this was mellow at planting and we've had a number of rains since then, I really can't show you tomahawk rooting. The roots are growing pretty well on all sides, even on the OEM row, even on the Schlegel row. But I think you know what tomahawk rooting looks like. I encourage you to look at your plants during the growing season. Okay, so the fourth row here is the Schlegels, and when I was doing the stand counts, it was real obvious that I could check, all right, yeah, you just got these little chicken tracks down through there. By the way, I do these stand counts semi-blind. I don't look at the sheet and then count. I just count and then write it down. And like, oh yeah, that was the Schlegel row. So I try to be as honest as possible. And if you notice, the Thompson wheels didn't win this year. If our fabricating data would make darn sure we won every year. So the next one is the finger till, which in this early planting, it was no better than OEM. I don't know why. On the late planting, it was respectable. And we look at the 3-year average. It's not bad, but it's certainly, well, it is kind of bad. 75, I mean, that's not a whole lot ahead of OEM. Now, maybe in some other soils in the Corn Belt or something, maybe it does better. I don't know. The next one is the furrow cruisers, which, not great, but not terrible this year. Look at the long-term average. No, I'm off the line here, huh? Okay. The 3-year average, the Schlegels are what's terrible. That's 75%. All right, that makes sense. The finger till was 87. So it was way up there at the top. So the finger till is actually working quite well. The furrow cruisers are down a little bit. 80 versus 87. You know, not terrible, but they're not really shining either. Thompson wheels, we did not win this year. We looked good in the late planting, 89, that was towards the top. Well, it was the top of the closing wheel comparison. In the early planting, it was not as good, 72, it was off a bit. For some reason, the curve tine really looked phenomenal in this early planting. I don't know if it's just the right soil conditions or what. Every year, these jump around a bit. And over the years, I've seen the Martin Spader wheels. They beat the Thompson wheel a time or two. They're pretty good. The Dawn Curvatine lags a little bit. The Schlegels are always terrible. The finger till has only been in here 3 years, so that's as much as I've got data on. Furrow cruisers are usually down a little bit from the Thompson wheels. So now we're getting that heavy black line. Below that, we're showing things other than closing wheels. So whatever's highlighted over in the left, that's what we've changed. So here, row 8, we basically took all the down pressure off, which you read the goofiness out of the Corn Belt. They want you to run no down pressure on your row unit. That might work in the Corn Belt. Certainly does not work out here. In fact, most of the time, it's half a stand. It's quite obvious. This year, that rain masked that. So you can see, looking over here, the 3-year average, 61%. That's pretty miserable compared to 87, 89. Not having enough down pressure is a costly matter. The next one is the RID gauge tire, and it also didn't run much down pressure here, 65 for the 3-year average. Not looking too good. Just because of misplaced seeds. I guess I should run that sometime with full down pressure so we can see just the difference of the gauge tires. Row 10 is the seed tube guard being worn out. So look here at our 3-year average, 69% just from the seed tube guard being worn out. This has got good blades, it's got Keaton with Mojo, it's got full down pressure, but just having that guard worn out drops you down from 80-some% to 69. 15% loss just from running worn out guards. You think you did so good. You replaced your blades when you should have. Did you pay attention to the guard? Row 11, we got a full width guard on there, but no Mojo on the Keaton. Now remember, this is a quick attach Keaton. They've got somewhat decent pressure, unlike some of their other designs. But look how much not having a Mojo hurt you. It was clear down to 55%. Now you say, well, there's more plants here than that. It's more than half a stand. Yes, but not near enough had reached the V5 stage when I did my counts. They were delayed by several days. Even though that 1,500ths of rain occurred, they just weren't drawing moisture as fast when they were just lightly patted in versus thoroughly embedded. They got to be thoroughly embedded. So here you gave up 20-some, almost 30% just by not having a Mojo on there. It's an important piece of equipment. And row 12 is designed to be one of the worst out here, and once you know, this year it's the best. But you need to realize that stand count is not everything. We're not taking these to yield. What do we know about shallow placement on corn? Costs yield. How much? Lots. Yeah, anywhere from 10 to 50% by being an inch deep versus 2+. Paul Yass's data, he's showing, there's a lot of times 3 is outperforming 2. Now, if it's cold, don't go 3. But if you're later in the season, you're doing double crop corn, doing something pretty late, it's nice and warm, or you're planting in sandy soils, go 3. Everybody else go 2. Make sure it's a full 2, not an inch and a half, not an inch and 3/4, 2. 2 1/4 if you're not quite sure. I'd rather be a smidge over 2 than a smidge under. Questions on that? For you guys that don't have planters, thank you for not falling asleep. We'll go talk about drills now. Okay, we're going to talk about no-till drills, one in particular, and also this one over here. How many of you run John Deere drills like this for your no-till? How many of you run one of those over there? How many of you run some other brand? Okay, a few. Those other brands are mostly just double disc drills that they're perfected for tilled seed beds, and they generally do not work very well in no-till because just applying more pressure to the same old opener doesn't do the job. You apply so much pressure, and you've got a trailing press wheel that you're trying to gauge depth with, and so what isn't on the blades is on the trailing press wheel, so now you're severely packing that area over the top of the seed. You're not controlling blowout of the sidewall. You're not doing firming down where you should unless you put a Keaton on there. So basically, those other drills, Sunflower, Tie, Crustbuster, Great Plains, all those, they're trying to sell you a conventional till drill as a no-till drill, and there's so many compromises. I don't even want to go into it. You may hate John Deere, and that's fine, but you're hurting yourself by not running a drill like this or like that blue one over there. So, getting the most out of these Deere drills. This is really the first true no-till drill, I want to say. The 750, it came out in 88 or 89. And they haven't changed a lot since then. Functionally, they're the same. A few things have gotten a little more user-friendly. It's sort of half of a planter unit. You've taken away one blade, one gauge wheel, and instead of a plastic seed tube, you've put a steel piece in there. But some things that they did better than a planter, they've got this separate seed lock wheel that runs vertically down the bottom of the furrow, and it's separate from the closing. And it's separate from the depth gauging. So those functions are separated, which is why I consider this to be the first real no-till drill. So in getting the most from these, as with the planter, do we need anything out front? Well, we've got row cleaners. In fact, Yetter has had a row cleaner for a very long time for these. They were not wonderful in a lot of regards. These Eric's row cleaners that were imported from Australia, they're far more heavily built. They'll fit on box drills as well as air drills. Like the Yetter, and they're a little more, I guess, work a little better. They're not so finicky. So we'll run this rig a little later so you can watch the Uniforce going across the terrace, see what that row cleaner does. That row cleaner is doesn't look like the bolts are tight. Looks like something's not fitting.
It's not flat up against it.
Yeah. I don't know what's going on there. We need to have enough downforce on the row unit to make it work properly. Now the John Deere's owner's manual says that you want this rock shaft level on top. No, they have no idea how this opener actually works. That may be the correct setting for a tilled seed bed, but out here in no-till, you've got to run a lot more pressure than that. All that rock shaft is doing is, we don't have the OEM spring, but there was an OEM big coil spring here, that you compress that spring, and that's what is holding the opener into the ground. All the rock shaft position does is, it tells you how much compression you should be achieving on that spring. Now, how much you actually achieve on that spring is a function of how much this frame lifts. Because you got this leveraging action here with all these openers doing this, the tail end comes up. So, now these 5-section drills, are heavy enough on the frame that usually we don't have to put a lot of extra frame weight on them. But the 3-section drills were notorious for not having enough frame weight, and so we need to put a lot of that weight right here over the transport wheels, because this is what wants to raise. It's not the front, it's the back. Now a little bit of weight up in front is okay, but most of it needs to be back here, where you've got the most leverage to keep the frame down. We put as much as 8,000 pounds on a 36-foot drill on 7.5-inch spacing using both ranks in tough conditions. We needed all of it. We probably needed more. It takes a lot of weight. So we like to rotate that rock shaft so it's sloped down and back about 20 degrees. We need to compress that big coil spring at least 2 inches most of the time. If it's extremely mellow, an inch and a half of compression might be enough. Most of the time we're running 2.5 of compression. Now, I don't mind if the frame lifts a little, but I don't want these wheels jacked way off the ground. Because a little bit of rolling under of that opener is a good thing. Remember what we talked about in the planter. If we can straighten that seed tube out a little bit, more vertical, it helps. On these, the trajectory of the seed, when you're running in the ground, this is flush on the surface, 45 degrees. It is a heck of a long way from vertical. So your blade's down here, it's aiming seed way past where the blade has exited the furrow. So controlling sidewall blowout is an even bigger deal on these drills than on the planters. So if we can roll that opener under a little bit, we've made the trajectory more vertical, dropping seed farther forward in relation to the blade. We get a lot more seeds down where they need to be by rolling that opener under a little bit. We also get more weight transfer via the springs when we do that. Because when it's like this, compressing that spring does nothing if the opener's like this. If it's like this, you're getting 100% of that spring compression down into the ground. When it's at 45, you get half of what you had over here. So rolling that opener under a little bit, so it's more like this, you're getting more pressure and you're dropping seeds farther forward. So we like to do that to a certain extent, but if we're lifting these so they're 6 inches up in the air, that's maybe a bit much. Cutting a furrow. Again, we need sharp opener blades. And these drills are notorious for hairpinning because something about blade size. They're dull, yes. They're big blades. It's an 18-inch blade versus a 15-inch on the planter. 15-inch on the planter is perfect for cutting 2.5 inches deep. They sort of work at 1 inch, not nearly as well, but they're perfect at 2 inches. They're very close. They're even made to go 3 and work really well. They cut a little better at 3 than they do at 2. So an 18-inch blade, I don't know what percent bigger that is, but it's a lot, and you've now got that really shallow angle that you're engaging the soil. Instead of like this, it's like this. And it's wanting to stuff that straw down in the furrow rather than cut it. So we would have preferred had they designed this with, say, a 16-inch blade, but 18 is what we're stuck with. So the best we can do is keep them really sharp. And the Osmondsons that Deere used for a long time, Osmondsons are still on the market, but somewhere around that circumference there is always a very dull spot. Probably in the range of 70, 80 thousandths thick out there. Pretty miserable if you're trying to get it to cut. You'd really like it to be more like 20 thousandths thick or 30, no more than 30. So we upped the ante by going to Ingersoll blades, which Needham also switched and Deere also switched, probably because we made so much noise about it. And Deere finally realized, well, hey, those Osmondson blades are really dull, and people are complaining. So everybody upped their ante a little bit. Well, now we've got the new 200 blade coming from France. And it's better technology in that it's harder out on the edge, but they didn't harden it all the way to the center. So it's actually a stronger blade, less likely to break. You might break a piece out of the outside edge, chip it, but it's not going to shatter the whole blade. So they stay sharp longer. They're fairly sharp when new. That's kind of funny. New blade. But we're holding that edge at least 20% longer. There was a study done by an OEM, and I can't divulge any more than that, but they did a very thorough study, and the new was lasting at least 20% longer than Ingersoll or Belota. They're specifically comparing to Ingersoll. So that's the new standard going forward, is the new 200 blades. Yeah, they cost a little bit more, but for as big a pain in the ass as it is to change these,
they do cut better if you're set a little deeper.
Oh yeah,
that does help quite a bit.
Yeah, these drills work a lot better at 2 or 3 inches than they're miserable at 1 inch.
Mm-hmm.
So the seed boots on these, even when they're brand new, there's too much wiggle in this. Jason's apparently repaired his. When they're brand new, they slop a lot. Well, what happens when you're running in the soil and you've got a little bit of drag here and the blade is torquing it, so now you're flattening that angle. It's already too flat to begin with. You're flattening it even more when you've got too much wiggle here. So you want to repair that. Keep those tight. You do not want them absolutely tight. There needs to be a little bit of wiggle there for it to clear straw out. Otherwise, you'll have catastrophic plugging. So you want at least an 1/8, maybe even a 1/4 of an inch movement at the rear of the boot. Any more than that is detrimental. In fact, with a brand new drill, I would replace the bolt with a metric bolt right out of the gate. Get rid of that extra slop that doesn't need to be in there. Various repair kits on the market. You can sleeve the ears, in which case you want to use a lot of anti-seize on your bolt or it'll rust solid to that. There's one called the Pro Stitch, which basically it sets in there against, well, it's hard to show. You've got these two ears sticking up. It sets in there, and the jacker bolts on top of that pull. It fastens into the boot. It's pulling the boot up in alignment with these top two ears. But you do not want to get all that out of there. You don't crank those jacker bolts all the way tight, or you'll have catastrophic plugging. Perhaps the best way of fixing that is to use a shoulder bolt that goes through these two ears. You have a bolt there, and you're clamping sleeves tight on the outside of those ears. And now the boot turns on that sleeve instead of the bolt turning inside that hole. Because anything turning inside that hole is eventually going to egg out whatever you got in there. And you got to replace the bushings or other nonsense. But if you basically you're making a spindle by clamping this on there, and then if those parts wear, well, you just get new ones. The Needham kit does that. With his, be sure you double nut them, because they tend to work loose. And if they work loose once, you're done, because it starts turning and you can never get them tightened up again to where they're sandwiched and turning where they're supposed to be. Well, I don't need to go into Eric's. Well, if you see the Eric's boot marketed in the U.S., we don't carry them, but if you see it marketed here, it's the same principle as the Needham boot. It's a shoulder bolt, so that it's rotating on the bolt, not in the ears. As to boot wear, if your boots look like this, they were shot a long time ago. That bottom edge needs to be straight across. You can see how much is missing there. A great deal. That's letting a lot of dust and duff fall into the furrow ahead of your seed, and you're going to have lousy seed placement. As soon as that's the least bit arced there, they're done. You got to have that perfectly straight across there. So even if they're starting to get a little thin here, and they're soon going to start arcing, just replace them. And always look in the tractor tracks first. Those are the ones that wear out first. If you've got a 60 series drill, get rid of the seed boots, get them updated to a 90 series. These have this channel in here that directs the seed onto the blade then flings them out of the furrow. As for keeping seeds down in the furrow with this boot, there was this little strip of plastic that John Deere had on there, white plastic, seed bounce flap, intended to keep the seeds down there. I don't have one of those with me, but I can demonstrate it here. Because it was a fairly rigid flap and fairly thin, and it would ride on the sidewall or it would get bent up, and you'd have this gap here that seeds would bounce out of. They also were prone to breaking, and they just get deformed and beat up. So Needham came out with his vanilla flaps. Sometimes they're yellow, sometimes they're blue. It's a lot thicker flap. It's tapered on one side. It's a little bit longer, and because it's thicker, and tapered, it does a better job of staying down in there. But it still, at times, will create a little bit of a gap here, and seeds will escape. Instead of having a straight flap, which there's no reason for it other than cheap, convenient, easy way of manufacture, I said, well, why can't we make this more like a curtain? So it's keeping seeds down in here. I want them placed before the blade starts coming up. So I said, well, let's just put a 20-degree bend in that flap, and we'll make it flexible so it can stick down in the furrow. And we taper the sides, and it does do that. It stays down in there. We'll run this rig later and stop it. It's got Ninja flaps on there. They're so far down there that a lot of times you can hardly even see what they are. And there's definitely no gap here. When we're cutting that furrow with the blade, these blades are intended to run at a 7-degree angle to the direction of travel. What is that blade trying to do when it's in the soil? It's always trying to straighten out. And that wears these bushings up here at the front, the main pin, until eventually you have no furrow left. And that wears out the seed boot really fast. Does a great job of sprinkling all the seed on top of the ground instead of in the furrow, and it wears out your seed lock wheels way too fast. So you can ruin your seed placement in a hurry by letting too much slop develop up there. Now the first little bit doesn't matter too much. That furrow's arguably cut a little wider than it needs to be anyway. So if I can shake this unit, these have almost no movement. Now, even up to a 1/4 of an inch here at the blade, I don't worry about it. More than a 1/4 of an inch, you need to do something. The first time around, you loosen this retaining bolt, turn that pin 180 degrees with a big channel lock or a pipe wrench, tighten that retaining bolt down. The second time around, you got to replace all that. We carry these from Eric's. They're a very high quality product. Teflon coated in here, so there's a silky smooth action. You're not wasting so much down pressure, overcoming the resistance of steel on steel. They're really tight. These will last at least as long as OEM and for a small fraction of the price of OEM. I don't think there's anything any better on the market. Needham's are similar, but maybe not quite the tolerances. Moving to the pivot points here on the firming and closing arm. These, even after Deere started putting seals in them in 2009, they still have a terrible tendency to pack full of dirt and lock up. and they're so much fun to grease every day. If you want to upgrade, we have the Erics. These have been on the market for 9 years in Australia, and their conditions are much worse than ours. They've got super fine dust like talcum powder that tends to destroy most anything. We do our bearing testing down there because it's such a severe environment. So they're very particular about their quality. And they've got these. This is fiber wound Teflon bushing. And these seals are actually made to run dry. So you never have to grease this again. Put a little bit of grease on it when you install it, and you're done. Never grease them again. They're much tighter tolerances. Needham also has one that's similar to this. His seals are really not made to run dry, so I'm not sure if they're going to last anywhere near as long. His hasn't been on the market as many years. But there's a lot more wobble in his bushings over his sleeve than what the Erics have. And if I start with something that's already got wobble. And also this is such a silky smooth action of the Teflon on the steel. So you're wanting that closing wheel and firming wheel to just ride along there beautifully. You're not wanting them to kind of be dragging from steel on steel, rusty steel on steel, steel on steel packed full of dirt. You have really nice action with these, so that closing wheel gets back down to where it needs to be right away. Maintain your springs. When you're working on your closing pivot point, this washer and this nut wear because they turn against each other. That washer is always wearing. And as you get more wear in there, it's harder to keep this spring in the setting that you want. So anytime you're in there doing bushings, replace these two items and you'll be happier. It'll track better and that spring will stay in place better. As for the seed lock wheel itself, there's been quite a history of things. The original ones were those super wide, that's so far back you guys probably don't even remember. Remember the really wide V wheels on planters in the 80s? They had this big thick aluminum hub. That was the very first firming wheel on a 750 drill. And they went for about a year and they realized, well, that doesn't work very well. So they came out with these, which was better, but it's still much too wide. When it's brand new, it's 1 inch wide. And it would spend most of its time riding up on the sidewall of the furrow rather than getting down to the bottom, unless it was very soft, mellow, first year no-till. But the more years you were in no-till, and if it were hard and dry, these would never even get down and engage the seed. That's how bad they were. So we started putting on the SDX wheels from Case starting in 2001 because they were just a smidge over 5/8 of an inch wide instead of 1 inch wide, and they actually get narrower up here and they would flex a bit. So they would never ride on the sidewall like that steel rim one did. So there was quite a cottage industry, and Case recognized it, and they kept jacking the price up. They started out at 22, and now I think we're up to about 115 that they like charging the John Deere owners for these. Well, that price got outrageous enough that some of the other entrants to the market. First, Needham came out with his, and he asked for my help designing it, but he didn't listen very well, so he came out with a wheel that was basically about as wide as Deere. Had a little better bearing, but didn't perform any better. That's his old V6 wheel. He pretty quickly caught on, maybe enough people complained or whatnot. He came out with a V8, which is much narrower, dramatically narrower. These fit down in the furrow quite well, and they're flexible, rubber, so they followed the furrow really well when you're on the contour or on a side hill. And this was enough of a success that Deere copied it now in their Pro Series. It's basically identical. Deere's not buying them from Needham. but the parts are interchangeable. Well, I got disgusted enough with all these problems with SDX wheels being too expensive and others, you know, these were good, but they would tear out of the rim a lot. Pull this right out of there and destroy them. Deere finally improved their game in, what year was it, 05? 06. Late 06, they went to these that we see on here, which is much better than those, dramatically better. But again, the rubber would pull out of the rim a fair amount, especially out on the wings. You'd be doing a little bit of a little too aggressive, drop the drill in too quick, whatever, it moves sideways and just pop that right out of there. So that was an issue. So I started working on one a few years back that we introduced. We call it the Duralock. It is urethane, so it will wear at least 3 times longer than those rubber tire wheels. And, well, it'll wear like an SDX wheel. SDX was a urethane material. I know of some of those SDX wheels that have gone 40,000 acres. The guy kept moving them from one drill to the next. They started out on a pair of box drills, 30 feet, and then he went to a 36 and then a 40. And a lot of the original ones are still on there at 40,000 acres, so they don't wear out. I expect the Duralock to wear every bit as well. In fact, so far, we have not been able to detect any wear. I mean, it's just 1,000th or 2. It's hardly any wear there at all. We've got a little bit of flex. You see, Jason's got a couple of them down here. Our first go-round, we didn't have UV resistant material, and they kind of turned it ugly brown. So the new ones stay bright yellow. We've got a replaceable bearing in there, which that was one of the things that people didn't like about the SDX wheel, although, you know, if the bearings go 40,000 acres, I don't know what complaints you have. But anyway, we put a replaceable bearing in, and we're now using the same bearing that Deere uses, a pier bearing. If you heard some rumors about Duralock shelling bearings out the first couple of years, it was because they were NTNs, and NTN should be a higher quality bearing, but they royally screwed that one up for us. It was a special build bearing. That sucked real bad. And apparently, Needham is also now convinced that urethane is the way to go on these, because just this year he copied us. He no longer offers the rubber tire version of the V8. He only offers the urethane. Now his are a softer urethane than ours, which flex more, but they also wear out faster. And you also notice something else about these. His is a lot thicker. And at one time I would have said, well, this is probably going to outperform this. But when we were testing firming wheels, when we were testing the shape for this Duralock, we found that the narrower was better, because it fits down in there better. And I always worried about, well, seeds will get past it on the sides if it's too narrow. It doesn't seem to be the case. We messed around, planned on contours, did all kinds of stuff, and this shape was always pushing the seeds down better than the SDX, better than anything else. So I think we still have some advantages over the new Needham V8. Yeah, he's still using this Seed Extreme bearing, which is a big problem. For whatever reason, these gauge wheel bearings, triple lip seals on both sides, gauge wheel bearings last a good long time, despite all their abuse, running at an angle, bouncing, smacking all this stuff. Well, for whatever reason, Pier decided that instead of 3 triple lip on each side, they wanted 6 lip seals on both sides. The problem with this is, to make this turn under the low loads, they had to lighten the contact pressure. They had to cut it they had basically cut the pressure in half. So now you've got 6 seals on both sides, but they don't seal up because they don't have enough pressure against each other. So I don't know why anybody got fancy and thought they needed a better bearing than what's currently in the gauge wheels. Engineers got fancy, they had no idea what they were doing, they basically ruined these bearings. And Phil hasn't caught on yet that he's gone backwards in that regard. Closing wheels on these, the original cast wheel with the bevel, it was sort of a compromise. Deere wanted this drill to work in tilled conditions. They still have silly advertisements showing these running in a tilled seed bed, which I think is stupid. I can't think of a worse drill to run in a tilled seed bed than one of these. But that cast wheel was a compromise, and it's not a good one for no-till. It does way too much packing, and worse is that it hops. Because of the angle of this arm, because that wheel is smooth, it hops. And the faster you go, the more it hops. And if you have corn stalks or milo stalks or sunflower stalks out there that it catches on, it's bouncing. If you go slow enough, they work pretty decent. But anybody who wants to drive a little faster, getting rid of that wheel helps a lot. I know it's a lot of money, guys, getting rid of that cast OEM wheel in these drills, but it, like Tom said, it makes a different drill out of it. It's quite remarkable. Now, probably one of our biggest competitors for closing, that's getting a little warm in the sun, is the Needham Crumbler. This one's actually a bearing type for like a 50 series drill. They got the stub shaft ones as well. It's a lot heavier. Not quite as heavy as the cast, but approaching it. So it does plenty of packing. It's thicker, which means that if you're in sand or really loose conditions, it's not going to go as deep. But also in hard clay, it's not going to penetrate as well as, for instance, our Thompson wheel. So and from reports we've had that people have run all three, the crumblers bounce more than the Thompson wheels, which you would expect. It's not engaging the soil as much. It's a wider, thicker spoke. So it'll bounce a little bit. Nothing like OEM, but it bounces more than the Thompson wheel.
Yeah, if you're curious about that, try a couple of them and then get on your four-wheeler and follow it. You won't make one full pass following somebody running it before you'll be really, really interested in trying to get all of them to Thompson. It doesn't take very long. And you don't even have to dig to see the difference. Now, I always dig, and there's an even bigger difference once you start digging and look at how it's broke up that sidewall. But it's amazing the difference that these things make in it. And consistently staying engaged with the ground where you don't have those 2 or 3 inch spots where the OEM cast wheel would bounce, and it'll go right over. It'll bounce completely where it doesn't do anything, and you'll have these little open gaps. And I saw it mostly probably in corn and milo stalks, but it's true in all of it.
In terms of customer satisfaction with our products, this is very near top of the list. And with planters, you got to get them set just right and whatnot. These have 7-degree toe-out built right into the closing arm. So there's no fussing with that, no fussing with spacing. Bolt these on and go. And everybody who's ponied up and bought them just absolutely loves them. I realize it's a lot of money on a drill, but it makes quite a difference.
I like what you said about lowering your seeding rate and paying for it. You know? And maybe use slightly lower rates for 2 years, pay for them over a couple of years. But really in your increased yields, you're going to pay for them in one. And some.
Ketons on these drills are really kind of a no-no. The reason is you don't have a parallel link. On a planter, a parallel link, the opener's going up and down, everything's maintaining pressure. On this, we've got this swing arm design. It's doing this through the field. So your seed boot is also doing this, and your keton is attached to that arm. It's also doing this. So half the time the keton doesn't have any pressure on it. Keton is really not suited to a swing arm design. It needs to be on a parallel link. Now there is a sliding firmer called the Fin. There's actually several of them on the market, but JD Skiles has one called the Fin. You take that wheel off, it's this big poly block that slides along the bottom. They're a nice way to place fertilizer, but they're not that great for seed firming. They're adequate, but they're not as good as a seed firming wheel. Everybody I know who's had the Fins has eventually gone back to a firming wheel. The comment was, they've got the Fin, and he says they really don't like it very well because it's worn out in 3 weeks. Yeah, and that big poly piece is expensive to buy, to replace. Yeah, they're expensive. So the question was, what's another way of putting liquid fertilizer down with these drills? There isn't a good one. It's all very much compromised. Some people try to run it down through the back of the boot, somewhere in there. The problem with that is it'll coat your blade and or your seed lock wheel and ball it up. That's no good. Probably the best is one that shoots it behind the seed lock wheel and ahead of the closing wheel. It tends to splatter all over your closing wheels, and you'll have a big, inch thick layer of dirt glued onto that closing wheel from all that fertilizer splatter. But that's the best, or maybe I should say it's the least worst. It's the least ugly system for liquid fertilizer.
Do you have any problem with residue or green cover crops wrapping up in these Thompson wheels?
Very minimal with stuff wrapping up on these Thompson wheels. Well, Tom does a lot of cover crops.
Oh, vetch can occasionally, but it takes quite a bit. And we're running through vetch that is 2 or 3 foot tall and pretty viney. That's the only thing I've found that'll wrap on. Had a little bit more issues on a planter. If you don't time your burn down right on rye, it can wrap. But that's not the Thompson's fault. That's my management fault. I went in and hit some rye with paraquat when it was headed, and then planted about 4 days later. That's the worst thing you can do. It was terrible. But had I planted it green or burn it down 2 weeks earlier, I wouldn't have had a problem. But it can wrap.
The wrapping on your drill, does it get bad enough you have to
Never
clean
had
it
to
off?
clean it. I mean, it just seems like it's only out here on the wings. I don't know if it's when I'm turning or something that it's getting on there. I don't
Well,
get
it's
it.
probably already cut from the other side and you're going back the other direction.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, you're cutting it and then it's pulling over, maybe. It's only on the outside 2 or 3 rows. And it's a little bit of an eyesore to me. So when I'm walking around it, I'll grab it and yank it out of there. Takes 1 minute, but it doesn't need it. It performs just fine. It just kind of sits in there.
Where's the wrap?
Right around this. Around that shaft, yeah. Oh, it doesn't ever get tight in there. No, never had it that bad. And that was some pretty big veg. It's happened a couple times, but it's not bad.
Yeah, I don't know, Steve Groff and Gabe Brown, they use Thompson wheels in their drills, and those guys plant into all kinds of jungles of cover crops. And Gabe basically says it's so minimal, it's hardly worth mentioning.
Yeah, I've planted through cowpeas that were vining up 6 or 8 foot up a sedan stalk, and that stuff doesn't wrap at all. Mm-hmm. Oh, a lot. A lot. Sometimes I think that the whole diversity thing is a little, it's very important, but I think you get over 6 or 8, then I don't know that you need any more than that. If it's got everything I put in the blend, this isn't related to the seeding school, but everything I put in the blend's got to have a purpose. You know, I'm not going to just throw extra stuff in there to up my diversity factor or whatever. It's got to have a legume or a certain nutrient value for cattle of some kind, or nutrient value for the biological life. So, oh no, I'll plant 1.5 inches deep. That's the shallowest thing I plant would be my mix, and that'd be 1.5 inches, 1.75 inches. Everything else I plant deeper than that.
So it doesn't matter if it's a little tiny seed or a big seed.
No, with the soils that we have, and they're so mellow, and then you've got companions coming up there that some of those small seeded things will follow. I've planted alfalfa before, 1.25 inches deep, 1.5 inches deep.
Alfalfa?
Yep, alfalfa. Planted it in the native sod and done it quite a few times and get incredible stand. So that I wouldn't do that. I don't know if I'd do that here, but I've done that a few times. I just planted it twice, 2 different angles, 10-inch drill. I don't run the spoked wheels.
Are you asking about the Thompson closing or the open rim gauge wheels?
Oh, now you're talking about the open wheel gauge wheel. No, not at all. Corn is not a problem at all. It's not at all a problem. No, I've never had anything wrap except vetch, and a little bit on the drill, like a planter, like I said, with some rye that was absolutely the worst time I could have planted it. And it was big. It was as tall as the tires on the. You couldn't see the planter. You couldn't see the bottom 2/3 of the tractor when he was running along. You just see the cab. I mean, this was some big rye. Yeah. That'd be a good question.
We usually run in one of the medium settings. Sometimes with the cast, I've seen people crank the pressure way up trying to keep them from hopping, and I don't know that helps much. Maybe a little, brings them back to earth a little faster. Just whatever you need to get them to close. Yeah, I mean,
most of the time we're in the middle notch.
That seed lock wheel squashes the seed down in there well enough that you're probably not going to be digging seeds out unless you're on blow sand or tilled soil.
Can you run those seed locks on max down?
Yep, good point. Run the seed lock on maximum pressure, which is behind the last peg, not between the pegs.
That's the only place I've ever ran mine.
Yeah. Never change it unless if it's so muddy that it's balling up your firming wheel, okay, back it off to the medium. But otherwise, just leave it at max. Way better stands, especially on beans. Anything that has trouble drawing moisture.
On the case seed firming wheel and on mats, the only time I've ever had mud build up is if we hang a wing out in the mud hole. Other than that, I've never had it build up. That is the only time ever. And we've got some really heavy clays in some places. It's still really fertile, good, deep soil, but it's just heavy.
Yeah, the mud shedding ability of that narrow urethane wheel is incredible. We've got so many side-by-sides versus OEM versus V6 versus SDX, and this is the cleanest one every time. Guys that really fight the mud, like eastern North Dakota, that's all. They don't even want to consider anything else. Well, we'll talk about the Downforce system a little bit. I talked about springs bouncing on planters. Well, you've got the same issue with this drill. And because of the swing arm design, it wants to bounce a lot. It wants to ride out a lot, especially, at that 45-degree angle. Remember we were talking about row cleaners. You want to push them, or do you want to trail them? Well, trailing doesn't dig in. Well, this is a trailing link. It doesn't want to go in the ground. You have to put a lot of pressure onto it to keep it in the ground. It's always wanting to skate out. The faster you go, it wants to skate out. It's like a skier behind a boat. It wants to skate out. The harder the ground, it wants to skate out. With a spring, it's just always doing this through the field. It hits a little harder spot and it bounces. And it just keeps bouncing all the way across. And the problem with that spring is, I said we wanted to compress it about 2 inches. Somewhere between 1.5 inches, maybe 2.5 inches, in that range, compressing it. So what if you go through a slight depression? Relax that spring 1 inch. You just gave up half your pressure. And if that's a combine track or sprayer track or even a track from planting the previous year, it's depressed 1 inch or more. Put a straight edge across it, you'll see how much it's depressed. So just when you need maximum pressure, you have the least with the spring. With the hydraulic cylinder, it's always the same, no matter where it's at in the stroke. It's not doubling when you go up over a berm. It's not falling off to half or zero when you go through a little depression. It's always the same. Now, there's no electronics on this. We're not doing any sensing, anything like that. It's uniform pressure. We want 500 pounds of pressure. Every cylinder has 500 pounds of pressure all the way across. That allows us to keep it affordable. Yes, we could adjust it for every row, but you probably couldn't afford it. In fact, Precision Planting makes something now that does that called Cedar Force, and I understand it retails for about 120, 130 grand for a 48-row drill. And when you get done, it's still an imprecise seeder. It's not like a planter with a double disc. It's still got all the limitations of this drill. So we're getting there. I mean, for 1/5 the money, we're doing 80-90% of what they're doing. We solve almost all the problems here. Yeah, it'd be nice to sense it on each row and change the pressure, but I just don't feel like this opener is precise enough that we need to do that. Maybe someday we'll offer that if we can do it somewhat affordably, but it's really expensive when you start doing those things. Just getting rid of all the variation counts for a lot. So we've got pretty large hoses going in and out, so when you do go over a terrace and you need to get rid of oil quickly from that, probably this part of the drill over here somewhere is going down through the swale. You need oil over there. So we've got cross flow hoses between the front and back rank. We've got these big 3/4 inch hoses going all the way across both ranks. So you can move a lot of oil in a hurry and keep that pressure very constant going over terraces. I've plumbed in gauges out here in the end openers and watch them going over these terraces, even hitting terraces square on. Once we put an accumulator on there, hitting those terraces square on is like the worst case scenario, because you've got all this oil wanting to go back to the tractor right now, especially if you're just doing one rank. If you're doing 2 ranks, you go square over the terrace, one's in the swale while one's on the hump, so it just flows between the two. If you're just using one rank, go square over the terrace, all that oil gets shoved back to the tractor when the cylinders collapse. Then you come through the valley and you need a whole bunch of oil. You can't, the tractor pump cannot deliver it fast enough. The SCV valve is not big enough. You do the calculations, 25 gallons per minute through there, we're needing to return a couple of gallons. You know, you're getting like a half a gallon a second. In a second, you've moved 12 feet at 7 miles an hour. So you've got this huge stretch with not enough pressure if you don't have an accumulator in the system. But that only happens in worst case going square over the terrace. So we've designed this for the worst case scenario. So going at an angle over terraces, that's child's play. We maintain perfectly constant pressure even at 7 miles an hour going at an angle over the terraces. These are not cheapy cylinders. They've got extra packing rings made from very high quality materials. We expect them to last a good long time. We didn't cut any corners on hoses. anything like that. We have very few leakers. It's probably like 1 in 300-400 hoses it's a leaker, because we've got people that know what they're doing putting them together. So you think, well, it's going to be a maintenance nightmare. I don't know. You've had it. How many hoses torn and leaks and things have you experienced? Leaky cylinders. You got one hose caught, and that's in a year and a half worth of running. So pretty minor. Keep a spare hose around. Barely getting out the top, you're on the verge of plugging. As far as dumping some air, we need a lot of air to move through these big long primaries and up into these towers. From there on out, we don't need near as much pressure. We can dump some. That's where the idea of these seed views, another item from Australia, we're the exclusive distributor in North America for these. It's basically your seed's coming up here and it's hitting these screens, fertilizer, either one, and going out your secondaries. And the extra air goes through that screen and out the top. This is just a little rain cap here. You can adjust how much you're venting with this in here. Now this works fairly well on 3-section drills, 30, 36, 40, 42-foot drills. It does not work well on these 50 and 60-foot drills because these towers are so low. To make these work right, you want your secondaries as close to vertical as you can make them, and with no sags or swales. These drills that fold so flat, fold over on top of each other with the 5-section, this wing folds flat over on top of that, they had to squish everything down. So the towers are really low, and you've got these areas where not only are the hoses horizontal, but they're actually going uphill. Now, there's no reason for that. This hose could be shortened or do something with it so it's at least not going uphill. Even if you don't have seed views in there, you have to run extra pressure to overcome all those swales in there. So if it were at least not going horizontal or uphill, you could help yourself a lot in terms of how much pressure you have to run, and it just keeps everything cleaned out better. And when you run the seed views, I would encourage you to move your towers up on a 3-section drill. They're adjustable. The dealers they put them together any which way. They've got some flunky doing it. They don't know anything about hose routing or need for being vertical. They just get them stuck on there and out the door. You want that tower as high as you can get, and there is, on 3-section drills, there is a lot of room to go higher without, they're not going to hit anything. Get them up in the air, get those secondaries the right length for each run so that you're more vertical. That'll help you all the way around, not just with seed views. And you can't, even if you have all your runs vertical, generally you don't vent all the air with these. You still need a little bit to push it on out through that boot, through those secondaries. Now the next step up, well, I say step up, is a step up or down or whatever. Secondary diffusers go in the secondaries. You can vent more air with these because you're closer to where you need to be. You don't have to worry about pushing it through that secondary. The problem with all diffusers is that with our broken up fertilizers that we get in this part of the world, and high humidity, things like that, you'll eventually gum all of these up, including the seed view. With the seed view, at least, it takes you less than 2 minutes and you've got them all swapped back to the original caps. You just twist that thing, it's out of there. So, install, uninstall is amazingly fast.
And what, have we ran them 3 years yet? At least 2. At least 2 years of running the seed view, we've had to do that twice. We keep these, and if we have a problem with plugging them, we'll take them all off, put the new ones on, and literally it takes 5 minutes. And then I'll go and I'll get a bucket of warm water and clean them up, and then we can put them right back on. We've done it twice in 2 years. And both of those had to do with really nasty fertilizers. So one time it was Elemental S that was real powdery, just like dust. And we were running it with, what was it we were running it with? It wasn't urea. I think it might have been ammonium sulfate along with it. Might have been blended, don't remember, but it was something that caught a lot of moisture. And we plugged them up. Another time it had to do with the seed treatment on the wheat is what caused it. We got too much seed treatment on the wheat and ended up getting stuck on there within the first, hour. Plugged it up, so we fixed those two things and haven't had another problem. They can plug, but not bad.
Yeah, at least you have an easy out. These, if they plug, you've now got 48 or 96 of them, and they're on the machine, and you got to go along with an air hose or a scrub brush or something and get them all cleaned out again. These also plug. Not as bad. We were dealers for a D-cup diffuser at one time, and I wish I could forget that, but I can't quite. They built up in a spiral. These are air guards, so they don't have all the dead air space. So they're a little better, but they're prone to like getting sticks and things caught in them. So if your oat seed isn't cleaned adequately, or even wheat seed that has a few pieces of straw, they'll want to get caught in here. Another problem with these is not all the way across here can you get them mounted vertically like this, so some of them are tipped, and sometimes seed wants to burble out. I have a love-hate relationship with secondary diffusers, or any diffuser. And obviously you get more done if you don't have them on there, but you're doing a better job with them on there if you can stand the headache. Now in Australia, some of the most persnickety people will run both this and this, where they're just trying to get all the seed slowed down. With these, you get a nice, slow, spiraling action through these. So we don't sell any diffusers other than Seedview, although next year we might be selling one from Australia that's vaguely like this. But riser pipes. These are taller than deer, and they have this enlarged elbow, which is important. With just a simple mandrel bend, it constricts around there. And when it constricts around there, it wants to ricochet up there, and it overloads one side. So you're getting a lot more seed going out one side of the head than the other. Now you need to put your buckets out there to see it. I mean, you can't see 10 or 20% difference, but it exists, and you don't want that much variation. You'd prefer to keep it down to a couple percent. Incidentally, like Intelligent Ag has a system that you can monitor how much is going down each secondary. You can sit there and watch it, and you can go back and tune it a little bit if need be. The Canadians are very particular about getting the same amount of seed going and product going down each row. And I think we would do well to pay more attention to that. So by having an enlarged elbow here, you're getting a pressure drop. And that creates turbulence, which is good here, because turbulence is mixing that seed so it's not overloading one side of your distribution head. Also, these are taller through here, which improves that turbulence and mixing. And these bends these crush points look very low tech. These actually outperform any of these other dimples that are on there. The company that builds these does a lot of testing and of looking at that scattering. So we sell those. That's a small air product.
1400 psi on the down pressure, and it's not enough. You can see that it back when we went across those deeper tracks back there, it cut the straw, but it wasn't staying full depth. Those tracks are pretty compacted. So you think that's, you know, the springs on there wouldn't even cut the straw in those tracks. So at least probably got seeds to moisture with this. But I guess if I wanted to make an even more impressive test, we'd crank the pressure up a little bit more. And there was just a little bit of flutter of openers. With more pressure, you'd eliminate even that. Looks like we are picking up some mud on some things back here. Picking up quite a lot on the John Deere firming wheels. A little bit on the Thompsons. As long as it's not interfering with function. And if there's so much stuff stuck to the side of the firming wheel, it's not going to the bottom of the furrow anymore, that's no good. If it's muddy enough, there'll be so much pack on the side of that firming wheel that it'll actually stop the discs from rotating. And it's shoving mud into the gauge wheels too. Put Duralocks on.
Well, the only thing is that it's wet. You'd rather not be out there.
It's not that wet out here. If we needed to be planting something, we'd go. I don't consider this all that wet. Okay, let's look at the blue planter, blue drill quick, and then okay, this drill here is a New Holland P2080 or 2085. 2085 is the one that's got the tank mounted on the frame. 2080's got a pull behind cart, same opener. It's the same thing as a Case Precision 500 or 500T. So we finally got a little more intelligent with some aspects of this design than Deere. Case had the SDX drill for a long time, which was an attempt to copy Deere, but in most regards it was actually worse. Seed placement was a lot worse with the SDX. This Flexicoil had an FSO opener that you probably have never heard of that looked something like this. They discontinued it due to maintenance problems. So this was an attempt to fix some of the stupidity of the FSO opener and make something that would actually compete with Deere. They discontinued the SDX when they brought this out. Case New Holland they bought the remaining stake. They had 40% stake in Flexicoil in the 90s, and then they bought the rest of it. So instead of a swing arm linkage, we have an actual parallel link here. So we're controlling the angle of the seed boot and the blade and everything back here in relation to the frame, much like a planter. It's a rather unusual looking parallel link, but it's actually controlling it, making it go straight up and down. We're developing down pressure the same way as what the Deere drill does, rotating a rock shaft and compressing a spring here. The blade, it's an 18-inch blade again, same thickness, 5 millimeter. Instead of being tipped towards the gauge wheel side like the Deere is, these are perfectly vertical, which to me is a much more sensible thing to do. The FSO is that way as well. I don't need a super wide furrow at the top. I need some width at the bottom to get the seeds down in there. So having the blade perfectly straight, it takes less downforce to hold it in the ground, and it does a little bit better job of cutting when it's perfectly vertical like this. Gauge wheel is in a good location in terms of fore-aft position because it's holding the sidewall down just when the blade's trying to lift. You'll see some other gauge wheel drills out there, and they'll have this gauge wheel way too far forward in relation to the blade. And you got all this sidewall blowout, seeds in bad locations. So they got all that stuff right. The seed boot is quite nice. The trajectory is actually aimed forward. Since it's all air delivery on these, they don't make a box drill version. So the seed's got this velocity behind it. So instead of this really flat angle, like the deer drill, and seeds wanting to bounce out of the furrow, we're now shooting it down in. There's a little wiper flap in there. And so you're getting all the seeds knocked down to the bottom of the furrow, right where the blade is at the deepest part of the cut. So the seed placement on these drills is quite remarkable, and their cutting ability is amazing. Where they completely dropped the ball is they didn't give us a seed lock wheel. So I know of long-term no-tillers, even in north central Kansas, a little better soils in here, that they've had these out demoed from the dealer and trying everything to make them work right. They couldn't get a stand of soybeans. It actually failed because these stupid wheels back here aren't doing enough seed firming. Could not get it to work. Failed in the stand. Had no rain, went in with their deer drill and got a stand without having had any rain on it. So it's rather catastrophic to not have a seed firming device here in a lot of conditions. In mellower conditions, well, maybe you can get away with it farther north, but it's really, overall, you know, look how much the percentage differences with the planter. A Keaton with light pressure versus a Keaton with a Mojo on there. You know, and if we had a seed lock wheel on the planter, it'd probably be better yet. And on the drill where you're planting in drier conditions, you really like that seed lock wheel. So to fix this problem with the firming and closing, we came up with this a few years ago when this drill first came out. We're putting our Thompson wheel back here, but to be able to make a spoke closing wheel work, we've got to have seed firming. So we've got a Keaton, we've got our own little bracket here that holds the Keaton with the Mojo down in there, and we've got a fair amount of pressure on there. It's not as much pressure as you get with the seed lock wheel. A well-designed seed lock wheel gets you, you know, 10 to 20 pounds on a little area like that. We can't get much over 5 or 6 here, which if you've got good moisture, works great. If you're very marginal in moisture, well, these are equally marginal. And all the joy of Keatons gets multiplied out into 48 or 96 or however many rows you have of this. So the long story short is this drill is capable of more precise seed placement than that drill if you tweak them out to the max. But if you're not willing to replace these Keatons every year or twice a year or whatever it takes, then you better own one of those drills. If you're willing to deal with all the headaches of Keatons on a drill, well, you can do better with these. I mean, they'll certainly go over terraces better. They're just placing seed much more accurately. Questions?
I see you're running a considerably smaller spring.
Yes, we had to go to a lighter spring. These are ridiculously heavy. You'll also notice that this drill isn't really in the ground because they keep bringing us this one that doesn't work right. This spring back here, yeah, we had to go much lighter. This one was ridiculously heavy.
You got 4 inches there to try to press in the soil?
Well, yeah, and it doesn't. So these are lousy at closing, lousy at firming. They don't do anything well.
So I assume because these things have been not successful, they're a lot for sale?
I don't know. No.
Well, I mean, like I said, you had a pretty sad rate of stand in what you described, but
There's a fair number of them that are running our system out there. There's a few that haven't gotten bit bad enough by poor stands that they still think they're okay. Or
so if they went to that, they're getting successful then.
yes.
So when you blow the seed ahead, are you trying to still relieve air or not?
Well, yeah, it would be okay to dump some air on these as well, but it's nowhere near as critical to dump air on one of these versus a deer that's aiming the seed back. And
You're literally trying to ricochet the seed out of the trench with a deer.
Yep.
And this is trying to blow it into the trench.
Yep, it's fairly well captured where the seed almost has to go to the bottom with these.
So there's no way to put a wheel on here then, as far as you can tell.
We looked very hard at that.
It wasn't a success.
It was not going to be feasible.
Yeah. Without a bunch of re-engineering.
It would be very, very major. We looked long and hard at that, and basically, the more we looked at it, the more discouraged we became and had to settle for a Keaton.
So I guess because of the parallel, you up and over a terrace, you will get more up and down consistency?
Yep. There's more up-down travel here.
Even with, compared to your hydraulic system?
Yep. Yeah, people ask whether we make uniforce for these, and well, we could, but it's not nearly as critical on this where you've got a parallel link.
Not necessary.
So is that why they got a lighter downforce spring on these than the green one too?
It don't take as much.
Yeah.
Because it's all parallel.
And you've got a blade that's not leaning out. It's a straight up and down blade that doesn't require quite as much.
So I assume the same thing happens with these. You'll eventually wear that pin and straighten up this, or is that not going to be as critical?
No, actually it triples the problem here, or quadruples it, because now you've got 4 things that want to wear because the blade's trying to straighten out.
So pins could be the problem.
Yeah, it'll wear there, and there.
Well,
just like a parallel link on a planter.
But then, yeah, you're going to get slop, which I assume they got a bushing, or that you got to replace the...
There's a bushing in there.
Bushing.